You guys ready? 7:30? Yeah.
We have audio, ladies and gentlemen.
We have audio.
Hey Ken, how are you? How are you, sir?
All right. Gentlemen set?
Yep.
Welcome, everyone, to the September meeting for the Fairfield Board of Finance. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I'm going to ask our Board of Finance clerk, Mr. Paul Hiller, to lead us in the pledge this evening. Mr. Hiller.
I pledge allegiance
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Hey, you got to love those quiet summer months, right? Okay. The state of play for this evening. Our agenda is to approve the minutes of our regular meeting from June 5th and our quarterly meeting from July 24th. I think Mr. Hiller has a revised document for our July 24th meeting, and the only revision are actually typographical errors. They're not.
there were a couple of typos that Ms. Keough observed. Nothing substantive
Okay.
in those changes.
Why don't we pass those
But I will
along?
pass those out.
All right. And the item number 2 from the Director of Public Works to authorize the first selectman to accept a grant of $8,000 to pay for the incremental cost of a compressed natural gas vehicle for the senior center. Item number 3, the Director of Public Works to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution to accept a Connecticut Steep Grant 2011 in the amount of $100,000 and to authorize the first selectman to execute such agreement with the state for the installation of a permanent canopy structure and the restoration of the staircases at the Fairfield Center train station. Item number 4, to hear and consider and act upon a resolution to accept a Connecticut Steep Grant 2012 in the amount of $100,000 and to authorize the first selectman to execute such grant agreements with the state to increase the handicap accessibility at Jennings Pavilion. Item 5, to hear a report and an update from the superintendent of schools, thank you for being here this evening, on the current status of the Osborne Hill School and the estimated costs related to the environmental remediations. Item 6, to discuss the status of the town of Fairfield's chief fiscal officer and the Board of Finance clerk. The discussion will include, but not be limited to, the current status, the go-forward plans, transition plans, the separation agreement, and our next steps for the clerk position. And item 7, hear, act, and consider upon a series of transfers of funds related to fiscal year 2012. Item 8, to hear, consider, and act upon a request from the chief fiscal officer to approve certain schedules carrying over funds for encumbrance and reappropriation from 2012. Everyone, this is our annual cleanup work for the financial statements of the town, as you'll recall. Item 9, any new communications, and item 10, any new business. Under new business, Mr. Brown, if you would please remind me to address the one issue from your building committee as we go along here. So any questions, comments, concerns from board members? All right. Before we move on with our agenda, I do want to recognize an event that's taken place within the town, and that would be the appointment of Mr. Kiley to the Board of Selectmen. Now, it's been a month and a half, I think, and Kevin was not able to be here for our last meeting. He was traveling on business. But I think it's appropriate that this board recognize him for 15 years of service on this board and 5 as chairman. So we've all worked with Kevin for a very long time. We relied on his expertise. Notice I didn't say age. And his goodwill and guidance for us. And the one nice part is we now have him on the Board of Selectmen, and I think the town is in very good hands with that. But we will most certainly miss him on this board, and I want to congratulate you and honor your service here of 15 years. So thank you. All right, and let's move on and do the minutes. So to approve the minutes of the regular meeting of June 5th, 2012, and to approve the minutes of the quarterly review meeting of July 24th. Any questions or comments or concerns on those minutes? As Mr. Hiller noted, there were a couple of typographical errors. Mr. Stone.
Can we approve those separately, because I was not here at the July 24th?
Absolutely. Thank you. Any questions, comments? All right, I'm going to call to approve the minutes of the regular meeting on June 5th, 2012. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That item carries unanimously. I'm going to call for the approval of the minutes of the quarterly review meeting of July 24th, 2012. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? We have 2 abstentions on that. The item carries. Thank you very much. All right. The first item, or rather, I'm sorry, the second item on the agenda is to authorize the first selectman to accept a grant of $8,000 to pay for the incremental cost of a compressed natural gas vehicle for the senior center. Good evening, Mr. Bartlett.
Good evening, Mr. Flynn. I'll be pinch hitting. As everybody knows, Rich White's retired, and Joe Michael Angelo is starting this Thursday, so I'm pinch hitting tonight.
Yeah. Well, hey, Scott, can you please extend an invitation from this board to Mr. White to show up at a meeting if he so chooses, so that we can recognize his years of service here. We've all greatly enjoyed working with him, and I think from all of us, Rich was always one of the most well-prepared presenters that we ever had. No pressure on you, but
No, it's all right.
but I think unfortunately he retired over the summer, and we didn't have a meeting to recognize his years of service. But I think we want to go on record of doing it.
Absolutely. I will make sure he gets that invite.
Thank you.
We're still in touch.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, the first item is basically, CNG stands for compressed natural gas, and it's a conversion. If we were to purchase a bus for the senior center in the future, this $8,000 upgrade would be covered by a grant, and then we would have the benefit of fueling for more economical means, natural gas versus unleaded or diesel fuel. So it's pretty straightforward. We commit to it now, but if for some reason the van does not get purchased, we are not held to any obligation to go forward with the grant. So it's a pretty simplistic and straightforward notion.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, comments from board members on this item? Mr. Brockville.
Mr. Bartlett, just curious, if we take the grant and we convert the bus or the van, whatever you said, and then it turns out for whatever reason unleaded fuel is dramatically more, for some reason, becomes cheaper or more efficient than gas, is that thing been converted, no longer can be used for regular fuel?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, once it's converted to CNG, it's CNG only. We do have some abilities in vehicles to run both, but I don't know that this is dual fuel. Dual fuel meaning unleaded and CNG. I'm not sure. I can get back to you, but I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, okay, it just,
Yeah.
it seems like, interestingly, just as a side note, it seems like a lot of money in terms of, if we're getting the grant, obviously, we'll take it, but
Right.
but to spend $8,000, how much could you possibly save on fuel? It doesn't sound like it's a good
Yeah,
deal.
I think, that's the thing. It's tied into the Clean Energy
Yeah.
Act, so.
Yeah, I understand. Okay.
Any other questions, comments from board members on this item? Seeing none, I'll go to the public on this item, $8,000 item. Seeing none, back to the board. Would you make a motion, Mr. Blair?
Sure. Motion?
Okay, do I have a second? All right, seconded by Mr. DeWitt. So the item is now before us to authorize the first selectman to accept a grant of $8,000 to pay for the incremental cost of a compressed natural gas vehicle for the senior center. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That item carries unanimously. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, he should be here. Item number 3, from the Director of Public Works, or should I say the Office of the Director of Public Works.
Sounds better.
To hear, consider, and act upon a resolution to accept the Connecticut Steep Grant 2011 in the amount of $100,000 and to authorize the first selectman to execute such grant agreement with the state for the installation of a permanent canopy structures over and restoration of the staircases at the Fairfield Center train station. Amendment to steep grant previously approved. So this, what is the exact amendment? What are we amending here?
When we originally went forward, there were 3 phases to the job, meaning the canopies would be like Phase 1, concrete restoration Phase 2, and the Parking Authority came up with some funding to do a brick patio. The way the steep grant was awarded, we have to isolate the canopy and the concrete restoration solely for the steep grant. The brick patio is handled under the Parking Authority umbrella. But when we first represented, it was all 3, kind of like a combined funding.
Okay.
So that's the clarification, is it's those 2 phases. Now, the good news, we have bids in hand, been through the process, and the $100,000 looks good to get the canopies and concrete restoration completed.
Okay. Any questions from board members on this item? Mr. Bolito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartlett, in terms of the reimbursement on this, we typically get the money not up front, but after the project, isn't that correct?
That is 100% correct.
Are we having any issues in terms of getting reimbursement from the state, or has that money been coming pretty smoothly?
In fairness, it does come smoothly, but it does take time. By the time we document the contractor's payroll and all the paperwork necessary that the state wants in order to get us our reimbursement, it could be months down the road.
Months.
But we have been, I mean, our recovery record is excellent, but it is a time-consuming process.
Now, just for the record, since we're putting that money up front, what pot of money does that come from?
It will come out of our materials budget.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments from board members on this item? So this was an item that was previously before us and approved, and is it correct?
I think it went to the Board of Selectmen. I don't remember presenting it to the
Yeah,
Board of
that's what I
Finance.
don't remember
Right,
either. So
right.
talk to me, Mr. Tetra. So it was to go before us and stopped, because I remember this item.
Yeah, Mr. Bartlett's been working on this for close to a year now.
Right,
That this steep grant has gone through a couple evolutions on some different projects. Then it was switched to this one. We got it approved through the design work we were doing, and then it spent, I'm going to say, 6 months waiting for DOT approval
And Metro North.
and Metro North.
right.
So it's sat on a number of desks there. So as much as we've been talking about it since last December, I believe this is the first time it's coming before your board.
Right. Let me ask, so I have a couple of follow-up questions on that then. Number one, having been a patron of the train station, those canopies are a necessity.
Right.
You know, I've taken a tumble there, as well as I've seen many other people take tumbles there, and actually take people out. Yeah.
And Mr. Chair, to your point, the Parking Authority did a survey of commuters a few years back.
Yeah.
And this is one of the top 3 items
Yeah.
that the commuters requested. So it's something that's been a long time in coming from that regard.
Right, right. And in fact, I think I damaged the stair more than the stair damaged me. But the other question I have is, where's this concrete patio? Or not the concrete, the brick patio, and how much does that cost? So you said the canopy and the stair restoration is $100,000. That's reimbursable, right?
That's correct.
Right. This, the parking authority, so not out of the town, but the parking authority is going to pay for this brick patio, correct?
That is 100% correct, and the patio is located on the northbound side, or what we call the taxi cab side.
Okay.
In the initial concept, we had budgeted $20,000 with the parking authority money. When the bids got opened, it came in at $27,000. So the parking authority is running a special meeting to see if they'll incorporate the extra money to go forward. The town is committed not to put extra funding into this project. We've stated throughout that it would be steep grant and parking authority money to get it done.
Got it. So this is only the steep grant related to the $100,000 for the canopy and the repair work of the stairs?
That is 100% correct, yes.
And Mr. Chair, just to expand on that, the Parking Authority is in essence a separate entity. Those are not tax dollars that are involved in that. They collect the parking revenues and rent for the facilities they have down there, like the Naughty Dolphin Pizza.
I read
The,
something about that.
Yes. The very good pizza. But they are each year they're charged with the maintenance.
Yep.
And so the patio is kind of an expanded part of that. There are some other projects they're looking at in terms of including additional bike racks, that type of thing, to kind of help out around the train station. And they take care of, with those funds, they take care of the Fairfield and the Southport train stations.
Right. Thank you for the clarification on this, because I did not remember this item coming before us, so in the initial part of the presentation, I thought I might have missed something, so I appreciate that. Are there other questions, comments? Mr. Belita?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I forgot to ask, if for some reason the cost of this goes above and beyond $100,000, that comes out of the materials budget from DPW?
It would, but it shouldn't, because, again, it's currently the two bid prices are under. When we did the bid for concrete restoration, we put in a lot of add alternates, and what we've done is carve the project to make sure it meets under the 100,000. If we had more money, we could go forward and do some of those add alternates. But at this point, we're content with doing, just the main staircases and keeping it under the 100,000.
Okay, so you're reasonably sure that the work is going to come in at the bid price of $100,000?
It has to, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments from board members? Seeing none, I'll go to the public on this item. Does anyone want to comment on this item? None. We'll come back to the board. May I have a motion? Mr. DeWitt, second. We're going to go with Mr. Stone on this one. Thank you. So, item number 3, the Director of Public Works, and to hear and consider and act upon a resolution to accept a Connecticut Steep Grant 2011 in the amount of $100,000, and to authorize the first selectman to execute such grant agreement with the state for the installation of a permanent canopy structure over and restoration of the staircases at the Fairfield Center train station. This is an amendment to a steep grant that was previously approved at the Board of Selectmen level, I guess. All in favor of this item? Opposed? Abstentions? The item carries. Thank you. All right, item number 4, from the Office of the Director of Public Works, to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution to accept a Connecticut Steep Grant 2012 in the amount of $100,000, and to authorize the first selectman to execute such grant agreement with the state to increase the handicap accessibility at Jennings Pavilion.
Okay.
Mr. Bartlett.
This project, as many people probably have seen around town, obviously with the upgrade of the Penfield Pavilion, we made it handicapped accessible. We've just done a facelift to Lake Mohegan to make those facilities handicapped accessible, and this will be the next project. Slightly different than the grant for the staircases where there's no town money. We do anticipate about $35,000 of in-house services to be spent towards some of the upgrades of the actual restrooms themselves at Jennings.
Okay. Questions, comments, concerns on this item from board members? Mr. DeWitt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is primarily doors, restroom facilities.
It actually starts with a main parking lot.
Okay.
That has to be brought closer to the building. I can actually show you a little bit.
Please.
I thought there was some proposed long access over the sand or.
Yeah, there's a couple issues in play here. This large red bricked area, basically we're moving the handicapped accessibility much closer to the building. It generally was way down here, so it wasn't terribly friendly for.
That's the big parking lot over that, right?
Yeah, this would be like, we'll call this westerly towards Fairfield Beach Road. So the one phase of the project is moving the actual parking facility much closer to the facility itself.
Yep.
And then this boardwalk going all the way out to the high tide mark
Oh.
is another segment of the project. And then the actual renovations of both men's and ladies' rooms is the other component.
So that's $100,000, and you said 35,000 of, is it our labor or materials or?
It probably is going to be primarily our labor. So the whole project is $135,000, $100,000 steep grant, $35,000 in-house labor.
Got it. Thank you.
Questions from board members on this item? Mr. Belita?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly sounds like a worthwhile project, but one question I did have with respect to the steep grant, who actually determines which project gets done? Because obviously there's a kind of a wide swath of what you can do with a steep grant. There are some limitations on it, but who makes that determination that it's this project versus something else?
We actually have a list that we've supplied the selectmen with, and we meet to review that list, and we felt, again, that this was the next appropriate one. We hope to, if the steep funding continues, we hope to do future advancements at the marina, as well as Southport Beach and Sasko Hill Beach as well.
All right, thank you.
Questions, comments? All right, for myself, when would this work be done?
We could see it hit the ground, which would be really nice, as early as pre-season, meaning we can get it done late winter for Memorial Day opening. Obviously, everybody knows weather's a factor on some of our success with that, but if it goes smoothly, it could go that early. I would say, if we don't get it off the ground by then, we'd probably go post-Labor Day. After living
next
some of
year.
Correct, of next year, I'm sorry, post-Labor Day of 2013. The thought there is just simply, as much as we felt we had to continue with the renovations of Penfield, we offended as many people as we helped with those upgrades during the season. So our goal would be pre-Memorial Day or post-Labor Day of 2013.
And the other grant that we just approved, for the canopies, and I'm assuming that's because it took so long to go through the process. As Mr. Tetro said, you've been working on that for a better part of a year. You already have bids in-house to know that that $100,000 steep grant is appropriate. Where do you stand on this project?
This one we did not put out to bid yet, but we think we have some pretty good numbers because we essentially used the numbers for similar work that we had just completed at Penfield. So just all we did was marry it into the square unit pricing of that project and transferred it over to the square units that we are dealing with here.
Well, $100,000 is a pretty round number. What was the amount that came up when you did that calculation?
Well, one of the reasons we elected to keep it under 100,000 is it's the way we end up having to go out to bid for this stuff. If we do a project that we accept over 100,000, then we get into prevailing wage issues. It gets into a whole different scope of projects. So we elected to stay under the $100,000 envelope.
Okay, so it wasn't a plugged number, though? The calculation did come up under 100,000?
No, again, the full calculation's about 135,000.
Agreed, I'm talking
Yeah.
about okay, so you factored in a labor variable in there?
That is correct.
So you're doing all the labor?
Not all the labor, we're doing labor.
Walk
as
us
it's-
through that.
Yeah, the labor the Department of Public Works will supply is in the actual renovations of the bathrooms themselves. We will privatize the complete excavation and rebuilding of the new parking lot, and probably some of the exterior of the building, but the actual inner workings of the facilities, the men's and ladies' rooms, we will rehab ourselves.
Okay, so this really covers not the bathrooms, but all the other work related to making it handicap accessible. Parts, materials, and labor.
Yes, except for some of the exterior envelope of the building would probably be subcontracted as well. Just the interior.
And that'll be under the
100,000.
100,000.
That is correct.
Okay, and that qualifies, the exterior work still qualifies as making it handicap accessible. It won't give us any problem for getting reimbursed.
That is correct.
Mr. Bolito?
That just reminded me of something. We had issues with Penfield about FEMA compliance in terms of raising the building up and, water going underneath. Is there any work on the building that's going to trigger any issues with FEMA, or is it just strictly exterior, like siding and clapper, that type of thing?
That's a fair question. I don't know the elevation offhand, but it's been my experience it probably is above FEMA regulations, just based on the fact that we never get water to breach there. But I can follow up with engineering.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments from board members? One thing I'd like to see on this is, assuming it gets approved and we move forward, we never really get the summation of the project at the end that says essentially, we thought we were going to use $35,000 of labor cost in DPW. We actually ended up using, $60,000, and because we used $60,000, these other projects didn't get done. Because obviously it doesn't, because it's labor at that point, and it's part of your operating budget, it doesn't necessarily come back before us. But if you're doing X dollar value of work down there and hours, obviously there's an opportunity cost of something else not getting done.
Fair enough. So
So-
I'll owe you a post-project recap of in-house services.
Yeah, Does anyone have a problem with that, or do you think that'd be useful? Just so that we know where we stand all in at this project at the end. Okay?
Sure.
Any other questions, comments from board members? All right, we'll go to the public on this item. Is there any questions, comments or concerns from the public on this item? Seeing none, I'll take a motion from the board. Mr. Bolito? Seconded by Mr. Stone. All right. This is item number 4, to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution to accept the Connecticut Steep Grant 2012 in the amount of $100,000, and to authorize the first selectman to execute such grant agreement with the state to increase the handicap accessibility at Jennings Pavilion. All right, the item is now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That item carries. We did have one who's out of the room. Okay. Mr. Bartlett, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Good luck with your projects. We look forward to their completion. And good luck with your new colleague at the Department of Public Works. I'm sure you will. All right. Item number 5 on the agenda is to hear a report and an update from the superintendent of schools on the current status of Osborne Hill School and the estimated costs relating to the environmental remediation of that building. So is Dr. Teitel and his team here, Ms. Iacona? Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a brief moment, Dr. Teitel, to recognize you and your team and to thank you. Because as soon as you were aware of the situation back in July, you immediately informed myself, as well as I know the First Selectman and others regarding the situation, and brought us up to speed that, for lack of a better term, you considered it an emergency situation that required fast action on your part and the part of your team in order to get the school opened on a timely basis and in a manner that you hopefully felt comfortable with. I was able to then relay that information to our board virtually within just a couple hours of you giving it to me. So we've all been, I believe, kept pretty well informed about what you've done. So I want to commend you and your team for that proactive action with us, for keeping us up to date, and actually for getting the school open on time. So thank you for that, and I'll turn it over to you. And
thank you.
Here's the bad news.
Right. Here's the bad news is we have to pay the bills. Right. Well, thank you for those kind words. You made reference before the meeting started about a quiet summer. I don't know who had a quiet summer, but it wasn't us. It was a complete team effort on this thing all summer to do everything we possibly could, which was our goal. Do everything we possibly could to meet the standards set forth by DPH and DEP and the EPA, so that we could, if it was all possible, to open in the in the school. And so that meant that we needed to have not just our staff working all kinds of crazy hours, but contractors, consultants, testing that needed to be expedited, consultations with a number of folks, and the bills are still coming in on that. So we did treat it as an emergency, and I will also say that in addition to our staff, the staff at the town hall were very good about treating this as an emergency and allowing us to use that authorization that you have permitted to, in these circumstances, to really move quickly. And it worked. We were able to open most of the building, but the remediation is still not complete there. So last week at the Board of Education meeting, I said that we were looking at in the vicinity of about $300,000 worth of additional hit right now in our budget, the current 12-13 budget. The number just keeps going up. We don't know when it's going to end. We still have test results going on in parts of that building. Right now we have the Library Media Center that we're still trying to remediate, so there's still work going on there. There's still some bills from some of the work that was done, in the last week or two we haven't gotten. So we're north of $300,000, and the number is still climbing, and it changes on a weekly basis. This is one of those things where, they say, well, the best advice we can give you is to try this. And so you try this, and if it works, your expense is done. If it doesn't work, you have to go on to something else. So it's a kind of open-ended scale here, because I don't know how really well understood this problem is. So, however, getting into the building had a big financial benefit to us. I mean, through the generosity and quick work of the Holy Family Corporation, we were able to work quickly on a lease. Had we needed to execute that lease, would have actually cost us money, and they knew that as part of our contingency plan. Fortunately, now that we're in the school, we don't have to execute that, but obviously there were going to be some fees and costs associated with that. Additional utilities costs, because you're paying utilities on 2 buildings. Moving costs, which would have been unbelievably expensive, as you're trying to get movers to move on the last weekend in August when everybody else is trying to move. Transportation, we're looking at 3 to 4 additional buses. On an annualized basis, a bus is about $60,000. So, we were able to avoid some pretty significant expenses, but at the same time, the expenses for this are going to be significant. And at this point, we're just docking them against our operating budget, and we don't know what the final bill will be on that. So that's sort of the front end. Longer term, this all started with a window project.
Yeah, Dr. Tuttle, can I
I'm
stop
sorry.
you there just for a second? No,
Yep.
because I think that's a good break point. Do members have questions on just this part of the
Okay, good.
project?
Yeah.
All right, so to be clear,
Right.
the 300,000 that
Right.
300,000 plus that you're talking about was the ability to open the school,
Correct.
and does that include the costs related to a temporary gymnasium on the
No.
property?
Now, we're going to need to add costs to
Okay.
that on top of that.
Okay, so
Correct.
that-
We're still working on that.
So that 300,000 was remediation efforts to
Testing.
date, right?
Yep.
For the building, not including, I mean, it's the
Right.
testing of the gymnasium, but it doesn't include the remediation of the gymnasium?
That's correct.
Nor does it include the replacement costs, the temporary
Right.
replacement costs of the gymnasium with another structure on that site.
That's correct.
Okay, so if we could, just so
Yep.
we understand the economic impact, just the remediation to date and the testing to date without the new gymnasium is $300,000+.
Correct.
The next issue is you need to get the temporary gymnasium in order to provide the curriculum for the class, for
That's
the
correct.
classes. Right?
Yes.
Mr. Walsh, did you have a question?
What are the estimates of the invoices that are in the pipeline? I mean, there's got to be some estimate.
Right. That's where I'm getting my $300,000 number.
Okay, I thought you
Right.
said the 300,000 is what we know about right now. So the
That's what we know
300
about that are invoices that are in. But there's more work that's been going on today, yesterday, going forward, that's open-ended right now, where we have no invoices and there's work going on. So it's hard to know, where that's going to stop.
Do those vendors give us estimates for their projects before we have them do the work, or are they just, here's our hourly rate, we just go until we're
Right.
done?
Time and materials.
Okay.
Yeah. We are going to try, now that the project is being narrowed to a fewer areas, we're going to sit down over the next week or so and try to say, okay, what are our, what's it look like our outside exposure is on this? Where can we finally say, okay, it looks like this is the outside number? Problem is, even they have trouble with it, because, they're going to go in, do some work, they're going to charge us for that work, we're going to retest. Based on those tests, we might have to do further work, or we might be done. That's what makes this thing so squishy. It doesn't lend itself to a nice, clean, all right, here's what the job costs, and that's it.
Do we have a project manager in-house, and do we have a project manager that we've hired outside of this, who's an expert in this field, who is guiding us all the way through this?
Right, we have environmental consultants, AMC Environmental. There are consultants on the project. They're the ones guiding us through. But also, we're getting guidance from the EPA, the DEEP, and the Department of Public Health. So we don't make a move until we know specifically that the EPA is agreeable to that move. So they are our consultants, but we also are getting advice from others. Obviously, those government agencies don't charge us for their advice, but it's not simply an AMC environmental decision on this.
Has our environmental consultant given us any type of number that you might be able to rely on of what he thinks we're going to be looking at long-term?
Not yet. No. Because the long-term picture is sort of the next segue. It includes the gym, which we have not done anything with.
Yeah, there's short-term.
Right, and
which we're-
long-term.
Which is this 300,000.
Right.
I would submit there's midterm, which is the actual temporary gymnasium structure. Then I would submit there's long-term, which is the actual remediation of the gymnasium and the school as a whole, right? I mean, would that be a fair way to look at it?
That's a good way to bucket it.
Okay. Are you?
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. DeWitt, please.
So, Dr. Title, excuse my ignorance for the whole scope of what started this whole thing, because we've been focusing on the real issue.
Right.
Did this start with us replacing windows? Because I know we've been talking about Osborne Hill windows, so
You
Yeah.
are correct.
Okay.
This started with our effort to get funding to replace the old windows
right.
at Osborne Hill. And that actually came forward to the board in the wintertime and kind of deferred on it, get some more work done, maybe package it, whatever we're going to do. So we're required, whenever we're going to do a project like this, to test for the sources of lead, asbestos, it's always been that way, and since July 1, 2010, PCBs. You know, most projects, you test it, it's in the caulk, you replace the windows, you're done.
Not so here.
Not so here,
Okay.
and that's what led to it. So, right, had we never put on the table Osborne Hill windows, then this problem would have been unknown indefinitely.
I'm only asking that question in the whole terms of 300,000. We didn't actually get any. We didn't do anything for $300,000 other than this remediation. We haven't replaced a window yet.
No,
So in the short term, in the short term, which is kind of past, the middle, and then the long term. The long term is ultimately we got to replace these windows.
that's correct. That'll be
because-
part of the solution.
Because I'm assuming if there were PCB and PCBs actually in the window, you can't just take that out without taking the windows out.
Right. We have to file a remediation action plan with the EPA. And while they don't put a timeline on it, you know, and our plan, a part of this plan would be to replace windows. Right?
Right.
So the longer-term plan that Mr. Flynn referred to would include, it seems to me, the cost of remediating the gym, plus the cost of replacing the windows. And maybe there's some other parts of the remediation plan, but those would be the two biggest pieces.
That's going to be the going forward plan.
That's going to be probably the bonding request.
Yeah, so let's, and before we go there, so you've
Osborne Hill.
got this 300 plus.
Yep.
Right, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to get to the
No, I'm looking
impact
for the
on the
middle step.
operating budget.
Yeah, okay,
Exactly.
thank you. Go ahead.
What's the, in order to deliver the program there, you've determined, and I think you've gotten approval through other town bodies, to construct a temporary gymnasium facility on that property,
To rent.
to rent.
Right.
Right. You're going to truck it in or whatever, but it's
Right.
going to be side down, it's got to be constructed in some way, it's got to be put up in some way. What's that cost?
That looks like it's in the $100,000 to $120,000 range.
Okay. So that means that's on top of the 300 plus.
Correct.
So right now, you're somewhere to deliver the program for this academic year, which just happens to correlate with our fiscal year, right? You're somewhere north of $420,000.
We're in that range.
And that has nothing to do with bondable replacement of windows or the actual remediation of the existing gymnasium.
You got it.
Okay, then.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Mr. Belita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in June, when this whole thing kind of got started, Tom Cullen had said that at that time, no areas of Osborne Hill had been closed off, and that it was not unsafe for students to be in the school per local, state, federal authorities. He also said EPA does not believe evacuation is generally necessary, and this way I love, since possible health effects are the result of cumulative exposure over long periods, elevated exposures for brief periods should be acceptable, so I guess that's hunky-dory. Then there was another article in June where the PCB levels in the hallway leading to the gym remained slightly above federally recommended limits. And according to Sal Morabito, both the EPA and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection for the state were aware of the test results and that evacuation of the school wasn't necessary. So, not being an expert in PCBs, how do we get from there, which seems like a little different scenario, to now where the gym is closed off and we're dealing with a major issue?
Right. The big, where it really switched over was they went into the gym. They're trying to find the source of this. Right? And went in the gym, and the number in the gym was like off the charts.
Right.
That's what changed the whole nature of the game, and that's what made it necessary to close the gym off. And really, because of the situation in there, postpone action in there and concentrate on the rest of the building. That was the biggest part of it. At no time did EPA ever say you need to take people out of this. And the Department of Public Health, both the local and the state, has been incredibly helpful in describing the health effects at the levels that we've had in that school. We had the forum on it. Sans Cleary's been great, and what you read is accurate in terms of the levels. The biggest problem remains the gym, and we're able to get everything else under control, basically.
Right.
That was the big point where it
Now, is it
switched.
still related to the windows? 'Cause I heard something through the grapevine about fireproofing on the roof of the gym or something like that. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, the fireproof spray, when they went into the gym to try to find the source of the PCBs, and they did sampling in there, found that the fireproof spray had PCBs in it. But that's separate from the windows.
Right.
Right.
Now, is that what put the gym levels off the charts, was the fireproofing?
That's what they believe right now.
And is that something that was done like years ago and,
We believe it was done in 1968.
right, okay. So nobody knew what was going on back then. Now, as a parent at Osborne Hill, if I were a parent at Osborne Hill, how concerned should I be? You got the gym closed up. I'm assuming you have all the air conditioning ducts locked off. Is there any real problem with anything escaping the gym now that it's under quarantine?
No, because we've shut off the system from the gym to the rest of the building. We've had that inspected. We've had EPA, DEP, and Department of Public Health all bless the plan that we have in there. And we've been communicating on a regular basis on all of this with Osborne Hill families since the end of July. They've been kept up to speed on it, and if they want more information about that, the forum we did on it, which was very informative, is still available on
Right.
the Fair TV website.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Brown. Do you have something?
Staying with the gym, when will you know if you can ever reopen that gym again?
That's something we have to investigate in the near future. I don't know what the timing of that's going to be. We need to get some more advice on that. We've sort of put that on the back burner because we've sort of triaged this. One is, can we get the building open and occupied by students, safely? The second thing is now, can we get the areas that are currently not available, can we get those online as rapidly as possible? And then the next question is, what's it going to cost? What are our options in remediating the gym? And what's it going to cost to replace the windows? And I think what we would do is, when we're comfortable with that number, bundle that into one funding request and bring it to the town bodies. But I don't know what the time frame is on that. I believe we still have to do some additional testing in the gym above and beyond what was already done before we can come up with that figure. So I think we're going to be, at least a month to 6 weeks before we have any kind of idea there. It's not imminent.
It's not imminent, so,
not imminent.
okay.
We can expect that that gym will be offline for the balance of the school year.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest we would be able to get any work done there would be next summer. And that would be, I think, probably the fastest scenario.
And then we'll know if we can, if it'll be reopened or if we have to tear the structure down and rebuild the gym.
We have to look at what all the options, costs and benefits of each option, and then bring those to the town bodies to see what the preference is.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. DeWitt?
Thank you. So just the mechanics on funding so far. So we're 300 in, we're going to be 100 and, we're going to be 420 in a couple weeks, plus, let's call it 450 when we have a temporary gym set up. This money is all coming out of your maintenance budget right now?
Coming out of our operating budget right now.
So just the bottom line, you're just taking right off the top.
Well, it's getting charged to Tom's accounts, and he's running a big deficit and complaining about it, but he's a sport. Yeah, we're charging.
That would
it-
be Tom Cullen, not Tom Flynn.
Yeah, Tom Cullen, right, right. We're charging it to the appropriate accounts on our chart of accounts. So, if it's consulting services, then we get charged to consulting services, and those lines are going to get blown out.
So, and I guess this is more of a question maybe to Mr. Hiller. If and when the Board of Education comes to us, they're going to come for a big bonding package, so I get that. That's the final package. But
That's separate.
Right, forget that. But the 400, let's call it $450,000 number, if and when you come back to the town for that, where would that money come from? Because it's certainly not in our contingency this year.
Normally, we would go in the
We would
first
go to
place to the
contingency.
contingency. Obviously, that, by action of the RTM, has been reduced to under $250,000. After that, we'd have to see were there any other savings, well, in the first place, any other savings within the Board of Education budget, but if there were a request for a special appropriation, it'd be a decision of the administration, Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM as to where we go. The last place of, that you can go is to the unassigned fund balance.
Right.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
I have a question that I think is, if everyone else is done, just, okay. Go ahead.
What is the program currently in school for the gymnasium, now that it's not there? How are the kids getting physical
Oh,
education?
right now?
Yeah.
Right now, on days where we have good weather, they're outside. On days where there's inclement weather, they're in the APR, and the kids are eating lunch in the classrooms. That is a very small space. We also, it happens to be our school with the largest population, which means we have double-up gym classes in some cases in a very small space. So the temporary solution there is really unacceptable.
Because
That's what
clearly
we're
they're
doing.
not getting the same program as the rest of the students in the district.
That's correct. They cannot.
Significantly degraded.
Significantly degrading, correct. And the lunch, the lunch situation and the whole thing is completely out of whack at that school, too, on a rainy day.
What have you looked at in regards to other plans that might be available? Obviously, you've explored the Holy Family situation. Clearly, they have a gymnasium that they have. It's not a gymnasium anymore because their school used to use it as part of a gymnasium.
No, I don't think so.
The church hall, what do they use that? They don't have basketball facilities
They
there anymore?
do use the church hall, the small church hall.
Because when I was
Yeah.
growing up, they used the church hall, they had that's what they used as their gymnasium.
I think that's right. I think the
Has
small
that been
gym.
explored to use that facility?
Well, you're going to have to transport everybody, to make that happen, which is a huge loss of instructional time, plus the expense of running, the buses. All that taken together would really be, almost worse. So we're looking at some different structures that we might be able to put out there and different pricing on those, whether we do a portable, like a giant portable, or whether we do a tent but these have to be able to be heated, and so there's not a lot of good choices out there for this. It's just not a good situation.
So basically, where you and the board is that if there's not something on site that can be done, you'd rather have a significantly degraded program than to possibly lose time on instruction or something else by having it be someplace else. That's the decision you've made so far.
Well, the decision is we will foot the expense for a temporary facility that will allow us to deliver our instructional program on the site. That's what the expense would be for the temporary gymnasium, as opposed to keeping it in the APR all year.
Okay, and when is the decision going to be made about actually going forward with bringing that to fruition?
It's been made.
Well, we're working on it. I mean, we have to go through a whole purchasing process, and we've got several options that we need the principal to consider. We also did go get some approval, I think Mr. Flynn mentioned, we get approval at Planning and Zoning for a location for this, but we have to make sure that what we're going to, if we're going to purchase this, it will fit in that location. So I would say in the next week or so, we'll probably make a decision on this, and then depending on the option we pick, it'll be another 2 to 4 weeks for it to actually get, put in place.
So basically what you're saying is in approximately a month, 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to have a solution for that program being not degraded any further?
Yes.
Okay.
All set, Mr. Walsh? Great. Mr. Stone?
I heard that we've been using that gym since 1968, and who's telling us we can't use it? Is it the state?
Well, it's the EPA's guidelines.
And they say you just can't use it?
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions? Mr. Bolito?
Obviously, this represents a major hit to your operating budget. Have you determined what you're going to lose in terms of your other operations? I mean, where's the hit going to come from? Because obviously, this is something that nobody could have expected. So you take this money from the operating budget to pay for it, and it needs to be done. So what's going to take a hit?
It's too early to say. I mean, we're very early in the fiscal year. There's still a lot of variables between now and even the middle of the fiscal year. So we're going to do everything we can to postpone some spending that we might have in the pipeline that won't impact, instruction. And obviously, kids are still going to have books and everything. But I've asked Mr. Cullen to look at his own budget, certain projects he might have that were approved. What can he, postpone until we get better clarity around this? And also we'll determine what the final number is.
Right.
I mean, I don't think we're at the end here. So I think it's going to be challenging. But school's literally been open for 3 days, and our complete focus has been on getting the school open, safe, and with the confidence of the community. And it's a little too early to tell where the hit's going to be, but I'm not looking forward to it.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that certainly we'll do our best to try and find the money, but with something that large, it's highly likely that we'll be back asking for a special appropriation.
Okay.
Thank you. My own question, and maybe this is, I don't want to necessarily open up Pandora's box here, but basically what was stated earlier was we've got a gym that this fireproofing was done, as near as anybody can tell, in 1968. This now represents a problem due to the other things that were going on there. What do we have as regards to the other schools? Is there a concern regarding the other schools? And how do we go forward there?
Well, that's going to take even more work. We did some initial looking to see, what schools might have fireproofing of that same vintage. The only school that we found anything close to that and Mr. Cullen reported this at the last Board of Ed meeting, so it's not new, is Dwight. But even there, it's different. It's not the exact same thing. We have schools in various degrees of renovation over the years, and it really seems to me that because of the real open-ended nature of the commitment, that at this point, we need to get sort of the best minds together, external advice, get some people in the town bodies together, because if you test for it and you find it, you're on the hook to remediate it. All right? Right now, the EPA's rule is, if you're doing a renovation project, you must test, and if you find it, you must remediate. If you go on your own to test and find, do so. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to do some additional work. It's just that there is a financial obligation above and beyond the testing costs that the town would be incurring if we go down this path. So we need to get some expert advice on this. I think we got to get a lot of heads together, do some more research, and come up with a game plan that will help us solve the problem in a way that, is cost-effective.
I do want to touch a little bit upon that because we talked about it at our last board meeting, and some of us have asked central administration to hire an independent consultant that can guide us through this, give us advice, look at everything, look at our buildings, and give us an expert opinion, and quite frankly, free up the time of our staff so that they can do the jobs that they were hired to do because they've been all consumed by this PCB stuff. So that's something that they're pursuing. And then on top of that, we are going to need buy-in and help from the other town bodies. We use them as school buildings, and they're our assets, but they're your assets as well. So we would be looking for you guys to partner with us in this as we move forward and try and determine what it is that needs to be done, if anything at all. I don't know what these people are going to advise or lead us down the path of.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions or comments?
Yeah, I would suggest we be very careful in this area. Clearly, we have other buildings of other vintages, and I'm not saying that you're suggesting not to test so we don't find anything.
Right.
Because I think that would be an extremely dangerous legal path to go down
Yep.
with the fact that we are on notice that we have a school that is a troubled school environmentally, and we have other schools of the same vintage. So to me, not testing is really not an option. I think we should follow experts' advice, but I think we got to walk a very fine line with that because the fact that we have it at one and we have other schools of that same vintage puts us on notice that I think we have a responsibility to at least test and look for other things.
Yeah, no, we're sensitive to that, which is why we want to get somebody in here who can help us, guide us, and get input from more than just the Board of Education, from everybody involved, and that includes townsfolk, about how we move forward with this.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, I'll go back to the public on this item, not for questions, but just for comments. Does anybody have any comments on this? All right, before I let you guys go, can I ask a couple of favors? Because you don't have enough work to do, so this seems like a good thing to ask for.
Favor may not be the right way to
yeah.
describe it.
Right. Yeah, an offer you can't refuse. Can I ask that you come back in October, whether it be at the October monthly meeting or the October quarterly meeting? I think I once had a boss that said bad news isn't like wine, it doesn't get better with age.
Right.
And so I would like to know the bad news sooner rather than later as to what you think the full operational budget impact is going to be. Obviously, it's going to take a longer period of time to understand, the remediation plan and the window plan and how much that might cost. That's a separate animal. But in terms of the impact on the current year operations and how much you are going to incur on that, and what your thoughts are to the extent you have them at that time as to how that's going to be funded. Would like to know sooner rather than later.
Sure.
One of the items that's impacted by this situation right now, not solely by this situation, but one of the things the First Selectman and I have been talking about is a delay in our annual capital planning workshop, which was scheduled, I believe, Mr. Hiller, for 2 weeks. So I'm going to ask the board separately if they can come back with some dates that might work for them in the October timeframe. Is Mr. Tetral still here? In the October timeframe, to allow a little bit more work to be done on this item as well as other items for that capital planning workshop. So if everyone can get back to me in the next few days, and we'll look at some alternative dates to get on the calendar for this capital planning workshop. Allow a little more time for you and allow a little bit more time for the town side to understand where we're going here. With that, I'd like to thank you, Ms. Iacono, your board, as well as Dr. Title and his administration for your efforts on this. Please keep us posted and advised. Obviously, we're supportive of your efforts in the community and getting this resolved. So, does anybody have any other comments they'd like to add? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming out
Okay,
tonight.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Item number 6 on our agenda is to discuss the status of the Town of Fairfield's Chief Fiscal Officer and Board of Finance Clerk. The discussion will include, but not be limited to, the current status, the go-forward plans, the transition plans, the separation agreement, and next steps for the Board of Finance Clerk position, which is under the discretion of this body. Before I turn this over, and I'm going to ask Mr. Tetra to come up when anyone he'd like to join him, and he's asked if he can address the board briefly before we get started. Before we go there, though, a couple items. In my 7 years on the Board of Finance, I don't think I've gotten more comments on any one topic than this one from townspeople in the last 2 months, which is very unfortunate. With that in mind, and knowing that everyone has their point of view and that it's a very sensitive and emotional topic, I'm going to ask that we maintain decorum in this and that we act as professionally as all of us always have throughout this discussion. Mr. Hiller, I would be remiss if I didn't understand that this might be a little bit sensitive and awkward for you. And we're going to try our very best, our level-headed best, not to address you with questions directly. You're here solely in your capacity as our clerk. That being said, I want to accord you the courtesy of, if you want to be recognized and speak, I owe you that, and I will do that. But that's entirely at your discretion. So with that, as our guiding principle, I'm sorry? You want to do a recess first? Okay, so let's do, fair enough. Let's do a 2-minute recess. Mr. Tetra, come on up and get yourself all set up, and we'll come back to this item. So we'll recess for 2 minutes. Thank you. Jerry, are you all set? All right, everyone. I'm going to bring this back to the board, and we're going to go back into session. What I'm going to ask is, since there's a host of discussions about this, or there's a host of interest in this, I think Mr. Tetra, Mr. Kiley, and Mrs. McCarthy-Vahey have chatted briefly. The Board of Selectmen are ex officio to this board, so to the extent that they would like to avail themselves and come sit at the table up here with us, please feel free and join into the discussion, as long as they're not breaking any Board of Selectmen issues or rules. But I just want to extend that courtesy, because I know they've been involved in this. See, Mr. Kiley, we won't let you away from this table as quickly as you might like. Yeah. So feel free, Kristen.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Great. And welcome to both of you,
Thank you, sir.
as well as Mr. Tetro. All right, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Tetro, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you. First thing I'd like to do is introduce Attorney Floyd Dugas from the firm Bertram, Moses, and Devlin, who has been our legal resource on much of this.
Evening.
Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
And then if I might frame this a little bit, first off, thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on the status of our Chief Fiscal Officer and recent events. I'd like to take a few moments to review what's taken place, the role and authority of the First Selectman, the cost components of the settlement agreement, and the next steps in the transition process. As First Selectman, it's my responsibility to make every effort to have all departments functioning at their best, both in addressing today's needs and in taking steps to prepare for the future. The First Selectman must provide the leadership and vision to continually advance our town by improving service levels and planning for the future. According to our charter, it is the role of the First Selectman to direct the administration of all departments and officers. The charter goes on to state that the Chief Fiscal Officer is appointed by the First Selectman and is responsible to the First Selectman for the performance of his duties. During this past year, I've had an increasing number of concerns, and while the specifics need to remain confidential, as with almost all personnel matters, I did reach the conclusion that it was in the best interest of the town to consider making a change. I initiated discussions with Mr. Hiller, and after some deliberation, we came to the mutual agreement that he would leave his position approximately 4 or 5 years earlier than he planned under terms described in our settlement agreement. For each of the steps in this process, I sought the advice of outside legal counsel to confirm that everything I did was proper and legal. It was based on this advice that I asked Mr. Hiller to remain on leave while we conducted these discussions. In addition to the advice from outside counsel, I also asked our town attorney to review our approach and confirm he was in agreement. As you know, the First Selectman is the chief executive of the town. And as mentioned before, the Chief Fiscal Officer is appointed by the First Selectman and is responsible to the First Selectman for the performance of his duties. This settlement agreement is a document that memorializes the terms of separation and incorporates the existing benefits of the CFO described in the benefit summary for non-union department heads and public officials. This benefit package is the current one covering all department heads. Based on legal counsel's advice, this settlement agreement does not require approval from any board beyond the First Selectman. There were several objectives in the settlement agreement. One was to allow for new leadership in the Chief Fiscal Officer position. Second was to allow for a smooth transition. Next, I wanted to recognize the long tenure of Mr. Hiller and provide the ability for him to explore future options. In addition, I wanted to maintain a professional relationship with Mr. Hiller after he left. The agreement arranges for a per diem fee if the town should need his assistance on future matters, such as defending a lawsuit. And lastly, we wanted to minimize any costs and legal exposure for the town. We were able to accomplish this in a mutually agreeable settlement. Mr. Hiller signed this agreement after the review and with the advice of his attorney. In my discussion with Mr. Flynn, he mentioned that he considered any discussion concerning the Board of Finance clerk responsibilities to be in the purview of his board. My initial thought was that this agreement should allow for a clean break between Mr. Hiller and the town. In retrospect, I believe Mr. Flynn makes a good point, and perhaps it would have been better not to have referenced the Board of Finance clerk position in the settlement agreement. Next, I'd like to discuss the costs of the settlement agreement. Mr. Hiller's salary remains the same through the end of December, and thereafter it will decrease. Upon Mr. Hiller's resignation as CFO, I've asked my Chief of Staff, Bob Mayer, to become acting CFO. Mr. Mayer has the background and skills to perform in this role. He's a CPA. He has extensive experience as a CFO in the private sector and has served over 6 years on the Board of Finance. Mr. Mayer will coordinate the work assignments with Mr. Hiller to ensure all work is completed in a smooth and orderly fashion. He will continue to function as Chief of Staff with no change in compensation. I did negotiate a flexible work schedule with Mr. Hiller. I specified a minimum, but not a maximum number of days per week. This allows for a balance of work between Mr. Hiller and Mr. Mayer. I did this recognizing that especially during the latter part of the year, Mr. Hiller might need some flexible time to explore future options. The benefits included in this agreement are those from current benefits that Mr. Hiller shares with other department heads. He's to be paid for any unused vacation time to a maximum of 60 days. Since he is leaving as a result of this negotiated agreement and not of his choosing, he is due the 13 weeks of severance. He is due his deferred compensation. He is due his post-retirement health insurance at his current contribution rate. He is vested in the pension program. I did negotiate a salary adjustment on the last day of work. This adjustment moves his pension level to approximately the level it would have been had he worked another 4 or 5 years as he planned. In recognition of the time that Mr. Hiller has spent with the town, I did not want to penalize him for the long term. Council also advised this was a reasonable compromise as a settlement. This was accomplished by using the existing terms of the pension plan. The salary adjustment on the last day fits within the budget for the current year. As for next steps, Mr. Mayor will serve as acting CFO through the balance of this year. This approach does not require any new financial obligations and minimizes the impact on the current year budget. It also provides for as smooth a transition as possible. I plan on setting up a selection process for a permanent CFO in the June-July timeframe. And with that, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Tetra. Okay. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to board members now. Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Tetro, Attorney Dugas. Thanks for being here. When I saw this agreement, I had two areas of concern, one of which is the agreement legal, and then the cost of the agreement to the town. You've alluded to some of the issues, but there are some questions that I wanted to get some further answers to, if that's all right. First of all, you, Mr. Tetra, alluded to the fact that this agreement was not subject to the vote of the other town bodies. Did I hear that correctly?
That's the advice I've been given, yes.
Okay. So this is probably best for Attorney Dugas. The charter says very specifically that the Board of Selectmen shall vote on all contracts. So is there some other legal authority that supersedes the charter provision?
Well, yes, in the sense that there are state statutes that give the first selectman certain authority, particularly 7-12A, and that is recognized in the charter, but like any other legal interpretation, you can't just zero in on one particular provision. You need to look at it as a whole and try to interpret it in the context of the whole document. So because the general statutes give the first selectman broad authority when it comes to not only the day-to-day operations of a town, but also specifically when it comes to terms and conditions of employment of employees, and your charter, in fact, by reference, indirectly adopts that same approach, then the question becomes, in looking at specific charter provisions, is there anything that limits or curtails that? And the charter essentially bifurcates the positions between Board of Selectmen having control and authority and the first selectman having control and authority. And the way that I interpreted that is essentially there are those positions where the terms and conditions of employment are reserved in the Board of Selectmen, and you guys are probably familiar with what those provisions are, but it's dealt with in there. It specifically reserves in the first selectman certain positions, including the chief financial officer, and then by virtue of his broad powers over the day-to-day running of the town, as well as broad authority to deal with the terms and conditions of employment of employees, anything that doesn't fall into one or the other, it was my view, fell under his role as first selectman.
I agree as far as the first selectman's ability to remove the chief fiscal officer, that there's that silo that exists because the first selectman alone appoints, the first selectman alone can remove for cause. Understand that. Can you please point me to the specific language in that statute you cited that you believe supersedes the charter provision that requires all contracts to be voted on by the Board of Selectmen?
You know, again, what the charter does is appoints the first selectman as the chief executive officer of the town. It doesn't get into a lot of detail beyond that, except that there are cases that have interpreted the statute as saying that includes with it the power to set the terms and conditions of employment of employees. So, that's essentially the answer to your question.
Have you issued a written legal opinion that cites the statute and the cases that you've alluded to?
I had prepared, first this was verbal, and then I issued a draft opinion, and I can't recall if that was ever finalized, but I did provide something in writing to Mr. Tetro, certainly in a draft form, which outlined my rationale.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd like to make a formal request that this board receive a copy of the formal opinion letter, just so we can review
Sure.
it for our own edification. Thank you. Moving on.
Wait, I want to,
sorry.
Mr. Walsh said he had a follow-up on him.
Sure.
Attorney Dugas, how is 712A, and I have it here if you want to reference it, different than our charter? Because to me, it's exactly the same thing. It says exactly the same thing.
I'm not sure I would disagree with that. I mean, it's a broad statement, and it imbues broad powers in the first selectman, and like any interaction between a charter and state statutes, you start with the broad power, and that is the power that the first selectman has, except to the extent that it's specifically curtailed and limited by the charter. So I probably don't disagree with that statement. I mean, the charter itself gives the first selectman, similar broad powers as the chief executive officer.
It pretty much just says he's chief executive officer, but then we do have the provision in our charter referenced by Mr. Bolito, where it talks about contracts, and that the Board of Selectmen is in charge of signing contracts. And would you consider this to be a contract?
Again,
Legally?
let me state the obvious. It is a document that's entitled, as an agreement, and without, dancing on the head of a pin here, that's certainly one interpretation. But the question becomes, is it a contract? Yes. But the question is the authority to enter in that reserved in the first selectman anywhere else in the charter? My judgment is that it is, by virtue of this position being one where the authority is reserved in him to set the terms and conditions of employment. But I will...
Where's that specific charter provision?
Now, let's see, 6.2A gives the first selectman the same powers and authorities vested in the general statute, so that, I guess, goes to your point that the charter says the same thing that the general statutes do, and the general statutes have been interpreted as giving the first selectman broad authority to set the terms and conditions of employment. And then we have this bifurcation in the charter between, I believe it's 1.4B1 and 1.4B2, where 1.4B2, I believe it is, reserves in the Board of Selectmen authority with respect to certain positions, and 1.4B1 specifically reserves in the first selectman other positions, and then there are positions which aren't addressed, and by virtue of the broad authority to set the terms and conditions of employment, in my view, those positions are picked up by the broader language in the statute and the charter.
All right. But the agreement itself is called the General Release and Settlement Agreement.
Yes, sir.
That's generally a legal dispute, correct? Would you disagree with me, or am I dancing on the head of a pin again?
A legal dispute. It can be in that situation. I'm not so sure. In this case, I would agree with that interpretation. There wasn't a legal dispute pending in the sense of a lawsuit or an administrative claim or anything else. It was an agreement that codified the terms and conditions that were worked out by the first selectman, and also incorporated by reference certain rights he was already entitled to under the department head policy.
But clearly, he had lawyered up, and then the town had lawyered up, correct? When were you retained? What was the date of the first date that you became involved in this matter?
I don't have the exact date. It was certainly late July, early August at some point.
Was it before or prior to Mr. Hiller being
Before
put on
or after?
administrative leave?
Oh, it was prior.
It was prior.
You know what, it's been a long summer. It could well have been even before then, but there's no question it was prior to Mr. Hiller being placed on administrative leave, absolutely.
All right? And the agreement itself, this general release, and so once you guys, the town has a lawyer, Mr. Hiller has a lawyer, and you guys settle this matter before it goes to court, correct? And there's general release information in here, which is common release language that are used in many lawsuits that are settled around the United States of America.
Yeah, with respect to the first part of your question,
Yeah.
that we settled it before it went to court, I don't know that it was going to court. This was, you know, an agreement regarding terms and conditions of employment. I'm not aware that there was a lawsuit threatened or pending at the time. In terms of the second part, there's no question that that has a lot of boilerplate that I typically include in separation agreements involving employees.
And it's to avoid lawsuits, correct?
Oh, clearly there's a waiver in there.
Okay, so, and I, just to give you my background,
I know your background.
okay, and I was on the Board of Selectmen.
At least I think I do.
And do you understand I was on the Board of Selectmen?
I wasn't aware of that, no.
Okay, I served on the Board of Selectmen for 2 years, and there were cases where we did not have formal lawsuits that our Board of Selectmen in executive session settled prior to them being lawsuits. So, to me, this is unlike, this is just like those cases. And an exact example of why this should have gone to the Board of Selectmen, and why the Board of Selectmen should have been involved in this. And so for you to sit here and tell, well, me, from my background, that this doesn't have to go to another board, I'm a little confused, because many other attorneys have come before the Board of Selectmen, both when Mr. Tetra was first selectman and prior to that, when I served under a different administration. So I'm sitting here scratching my head saying, why? And there was one several months ago while I was still serving on the Board of Selectmen, which was not a lawsuit. It was just a settlement before it got to a lawsuit. And I have to sit here saying, when I read this, I have to believe that Mr. Hiller would not have just walked away from this with nothing, with not all these benefits that are contained in this agreement. I'd have to believe, as an attorney, that he would have probably sought redress. I presume that he wasn't just asking for nothing and we just all of a sudden gave him all of these things. So to me, this is a settlement to avoid litigation, a lot of it.
With all due respect, I'm not sure, having been involved in the process at that point in time, that's an appropriate characterization, but I understand why you see it that way.
Do you believe that lawsuits based under the general statutes or our charter have to go to the Board of Selectmen?
I'm sorry,
Do you
ask.
believe that settlement of potential claims under the charter or state statute need to go to the Board of Selectmen?
I'm not sure, I looked at that question. The question I looked at is what Mr. Tetro's authority was at first selectman relative to the terms and conditions of employment for the positions we were dealing with, and concluded otherwise. I did inquire at the time about what the practice or history had been. Wasn't aware of any of that. I was aware that there was a department head agreement that was an agreement that apparently had not, at least for the past 10 or 12 years, gone past the Board of Selectmen. So that lended support for the conclusion that when you're dealing with items that fall within the jurisdiction of the first selectman, that was an exception based upon his authority to enter in such agreements.
When did you become aware of that agreement? Because quite frankly, I wasn't aware of it.
I became aware of that agreement, obviously, prior to the settlement, general release and settlement agreement being entered into, because the conversation was along the lines of, well, what is the CFO entitled to? You know, he's not in a collective bargaining unit, obviously, so I wanted to know, well, what written documents are there? And the document was produced. I recall seeing two documents. One had been amended by Mr. Flato.
Right.
And there was a prior document where there were some changes made. I can't recall them, but clearly it went back 10 or 12 years. And my understanding, rightly or wrongly, was that that document, the terms and conditions of employment for the department heads, and in particular the CFO, as I was looking at it, had not been brought to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay. A quick question that I have, and I don't mean to interrupt. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. But I do have a couple questions, and it goes back to something that Mr. Tetra had to say. Okay, number one, based on the public comments that have since been issued by Mr. Tetra, and the fact that there was a settlement or a payout or compensation or whatever you want to say to Mr. Hiller, I can argue that he wasn't terminated or didn't leave, quote-unquote, for cause, right? But Mr. Tetra said in his remarks that Mr. Hiller didn't leave voluntarily. So obviously, there was a contract to get Mr. Hiller to leave voluntarily, right?
I'm not entirely sure I'm following.
Well, I'm just going back to Mr. Walsh's point that, you know, there was a dispute. There was a dispute over whether Mr. Hiller was going to leave or not, right?
The only way I can respond to that is to say that there was a conversation. The conversation resulted in an agreement. And, you know what the terms and conditions of those agreements were. There were no proceedings started. So, again, I don't want to, seem like I'm playing semantics, because I'm truly not trying to do that. It hadn't risen to that point. It was essentially a conversation initiated by Mr. Tetra resulting in a mutual agreement.
Okay, so he didn't leave for cause. He didn't walk into that room knowing he was going to leave. He walked out of that room and walked out of the office, and 2 weeks later or whatever, he found out he was going to leave. I can read into that quite a bit, but my question becomes, and I need an honest answer on this because people have said both ways on this, that the charter requires the Board of Selectmen to remove the chief fiscal officer if it wasn't for other than cause. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not.
I
That's
don't
what
read
people
it
have
that
said
way.
to me.
I do not read it that way. It is solely the First Selectman's authority under the charter. Cause, not cause,
Really?
any circumstances.
So I'm honestly asking, so it's solely the first selectman who can say the chief fiscal officer goes away?
It is solely the First Selectman that appoints, removes.
I agree with the
and
points. I don't know
sets
about
the terms and
remove.
conditions of employment for the CFO under the charter. At least that's my reading of it.
What do the provisions mean that the department head can ask for a for-cause hearing? What puts that into play?
I think essentially that what the charter contemplated, in most towns that I'm familiar with, the CFO serves at the pleasure of the First Selectman. For whatever reason, I'm not going to question it, this town chose not to provide for that, and to provide that the person could only be removed for cause.
Well, that gets back to Mr. Flynn's point. You just said to him that he could be removed for cause or not for cause.
Correct.
You just said now that he has to remove for cause, because there's a provision in here that does say that he can ask for a for-cause hearing.
No, I'm sorry, I may have misspoke. What I meant to say was,
That's what I didn't understand.
the charter says that if there's going to be an involuntary termination, that the CFO can only involuntarily be removed for cause. My point was that whether it's for cause or not for cause, that the First Selectman has the authority to remove, appoint, and set the terms and conditions for the CFO.
So he could have asked for a for-cause hearing if it's not voluntary that he resigns.
He could have.
And then we'd have to find cause, correct?
Correct. Oh,
And
no,
if-
not we as in the Board of Finance, not we
Mr.
as in
Tetreault.
the Board of Selectmen, but Mr. Tetreault.
Mr.
correct.
Tetreault. And if Mr. Hiller felt aggrieved by that the same person who terminated him found cause, whatever way, his redress is to the Superior Court, right? For a Superior Court judge to determine whether Mr. Tetreault's decision on that is a logical decision.
Well, no, I
Or
wouldn't.
reas-
I
or
wouldn't-
reasonable.
I wouldn't agree with that. What I would say is, there is no right to appeal to Superior Court from the charter by virtue of the charter or statute. His decision is final, but as you and I know, if Mr. Hiller, under the scenario you've laid out, felt that his constitutional right to due process, substantive or procedural, were violated, or his contract, quote-unquote, with the town, then he'd certainly have a right to appeal that to Superior Court. Maybe it's a distinction that you and I and any other lawyers in the room is the only one that can appreciate, but there is not an automatic appeal to Superior Court. You'd have to have some legal theory that a right was violated.
Yes. And at the end of the day, if that were to happen, they would look at whether it was a reasonable decision by Mr. Tetro based on what he found at his for cause hearing.
I don't think so. I think what they would do is ask, was there substantive due process provided? In other words, and maybe that's your point, was there cause?
Yes. Was there cause?
Correct. They would certainly make that determination. Cause as loosely defined as a good reason as opposed to an arbitrary and capricious one.
Exactly.
And then they would look to make sure that there was no procedural due process violation, gave them an opportunity
Number
to
of days, all that
have
stuff
his
that's
say
required.
and so
Yes.
forth, correct.
Yes. Okay. The more we talk about this, the more it seems like it's a legal dispute and it should have gone to the Board of Selectmen. I mean, we keep going around and around, and, we can make, I know you don't want to talk semantics, but that's what we're kind of getting down to, because we had, Mr. Hiller, sounds like he did not know he was getting called in to be asked to resign, and we have him coming out of there, being given some options, and then put on administrative leave, and to explore that, and then you settling. It's a settlement agreement with, to avoid lawsuits. I mean, so from my perspective of having been on the Board of Selectmen, I mean, we are now arguing semantics, that it should have gone to I believe it should have gone to the Board of Selectmen. And I guess to Kevin Kiley and to Kristen, did either of you get presented with this settlement agreement prior to you learning about it and it being signed? Learn in any way.
And Kevin?
Prior to this being signed,
Yes.
I was informed the day of the Board of Selectmen meeting, possibly the day before, or the evening before, but when we were given notice of the agreement, a copy of the agreement the morning after the Board of Selectmen meeting. But I actually have a question, if I may. I don't know if Mr. Kyle.
Yeah, let's have Kevin answer, and then you can go, Kristen.
No.
Okay.
So I think Mr. Walsh's question, I think one of the things I heard you saying before was essentially that this legal agreement was within the purview of the first selectman because it was employment related. In other words, Mr. Walsh is talking about arguing semantics. Actually, before I go on, I think that we're sitting here tonight in part because my understanding is you're not available. The schedule's allowed for us to be here, just as members of the Board of Selectmen. So I appreciate and thank the chair for inviting us to the table and be a part of this conversation as members of the Board of Selectmen. But I think back to the issue of the semantics in terms of, can you help us understand the difference between the legal agreements that do come before the Board of Selectmen as a standard matter and this agreement as an employment matter? And is there, in fact, a difference in statute per charter, or is this more an issue of semantics?
A lot of what Mr. Walsh is referring to as slip and fall type things.
In all candor, I did not look at the broader question of what has to go before the Board of Selectmen in terms of settlements agreements. The only question I looked at was this agreement with the CFO, and based upon the authority between the charter and the statute, it was my belief that the first selectman had sole authority to make that particular decision. That now, if you're asking me if a slip and fall case should come before the board, I mean, in all honesty, I haven't looked at it. Certainly any contracts, I don't doubt for a moment, for services, copiers or, architect or things of that nature, I don't.
How about the services for the town's financial manager?
That, in my view, is different because of the holistic reading of the charter. And again, that was the only question I was asked to look at, it's the only question I looked at, and that was the conclusion I reached. So, you know, in all honesty, I can't really tell you at this point without giving it some more, you know, studying it further and looking at it, how, you know, where the line is. I don't honestly know the answer to that question.
Can I follow up?
Please.
Just, I see the town attorney moving forward, and one of my questions is, was this something that you consulted with him about? Did you talk with him in terms of his own experience of the charter, or was this solely your legal opinion and legal review?
Initially, you know, I was asked by Mr. Tetro, you know, as a labor and employment lawyer, to consult with him in various aspects of this. I don't know that, I can't tell you the exact point that I dealt with Mr. Lesser on the issue. I know that we did, frankly, you know, at some point, have a discussion about a variety of these points. I told him my views. My recollection is he didn't disagree with my interpretation of this very specific issue, and we didn't have a broader, I don't recall a broader conversation.
One more, may I?
Please.
Back to my initial question. I think what I'm hearing you say is that your understanding of the charter was that the first selectman had very clear power to make the decision. And when you say make the decision, can you define that as the decision in terms of employment as well as a decision to enter into the settlement agreement, both of those things?
Again, in my view, under the charter, he has complete authority to hire, terminate, and set the terms and conditions of employment. Obviously, he's got to, you know, it's got to be within the budget, but that he has the sole authority for doing that. And that was, again, the very limited focus of what I was asked to do and the limited focus of what I opined as to.
Mr. Bolito? Oh, wait, Mr. Brockfield had one first. Yeah, please.
Thanks. I'm going to ask, I'll ask you a legal question because we're on that, but I have some financial questions, but we'll come to that later. I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, one thing I'm having some trouble with on this question is actually for both of you, ironic, is you sound like a very skilled and experienced attorney, and I know Mr. Walsh and Mr. Bolito are both skilled and experienced. So we have a, what's called an honest difference of opinion in terms of how this is to be read. What I don't understand is why didn't we just go to the Board of Selectmen with this? What was the need to exert power or a power play? You know, I'm trying to, I don't really understand why. I guess it's really more for Mr. Tetro, but why wouldn't we have just brought this agreement before the Board of Selectmen and said this is what you think's in the best interest of the town and what you'd like to do, and I'd like you to ratify it?
Simply put, we followed the process as outlined by legal counsel in terms of the steps we go through to make sure it was proper.
Was legal counsel filled in on the way past precedents have been done in this town for over 30 years? That the Board of Selectmen has always handled employment issues. One of the first things First Selectman Flato pulled me into his office when I was appointed to replace Ralph Boley on the Board of Selectmen was, Jim, some of the toughest things we have to do is work on employment issues at the Board of Selectmen level. And it's very hard because there's very tough facts. We're dealing with people's personal lives. And I'm not saying anything that was said in executive session. This was said to me personally on things we were going to have to deal with. And we have to deal with them, unfortunately, frequently. And they always come to the Board of Selectmen level. And it's stuff that I bring, and I always bring to the Board of Selectmen. This seems to be a rather major decision, okay? Getting rid of the fiscal officer when we're not hearing any cause whatsoever. I mean, I think your words tonight, Mike, were you felt an increasing number of concerns, which I'll tell you is bordering on claiming that there's cause. And that it's the best interest of the town. But the fact that you didn't bring it to the Board of Selectmen, or even with the fiscal officer in executive session to this body, is concerning to, I think, a number of people I've had conversations with. And I don't understand why you would try to get away from the Board of Selectmen, because we can argue the semantics all we want. We can argue that you have the right to make employment decisions. But in regards to the package of benefits, which I consider to be vast in this agreement, and that are going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money this year and for future years, I don't know how you didn't bring this agreement, whether you call it a contract or a separation agreement, at a minimum to the Board of Selectmen. I just don't understand it, especially with our past practice of always taking employment issues to the Board of Selectmen. I mean, we've had stuff with a gentleman who was the director and head of our library, which we had to deal with, the town had to deal with. The first selectman, under what Mr. Dugas is saying, could have just taken his own action. That didn't.
Not with the director of the library, that has to go.
Well, you had to go to the trustees as well. You go to the trustees.
It gets back to which positions, and that's why the charter is very specific in terms of who this reports to. And understandably, Mr. Walsh, you have to have all the facts in front of you to do that, and without all the facts, it makes it hard. Part of the agreement here is that we are not talking about those. We're not getting into that type of discussion. So it's hard to evaluate that from your standpoint, and I can appreciate that. But we very clearly tried to follow a legal process, step by step on this, to make sure that everything we did was proper and correct.
And getting back to Mr. Brockfeld's point, I do not understand why it wouldn't have taken to the Board of Selectmen level at a minimum. Why was there the need in other cases where we settle cases, and we settle them before they go to lawsuit, why we wouldn't bring it to the Board of Selectmen to say, we have this problem, this is the package of benefits that I plan on giving Mr. Hiller, and have a vote on it?
You know, I certainly don't have 30 years of history. I'm not going to pretend that I do. You know, I had the charter in front of me. It seemed reasonably clear to me. And I had made at least, we had had some conversations about what's happened in the past, and again, the department head thing was sort of the glaring example that we had, only because it was very pertinent to what we were working out. And, you know, my understanding was going back 2 iterations that had not been taken to the Board of Selectmen, so that affirmed to me the conclusions I had drawn, and I don't remember all the details, but
Several wrongs don't make a right.
well, yeah, perhaps, and if I thought that, you know, the charter clearly did not give him that authority, I would agree with you 100%, that, you know, but the charter, again, in my opinion, without being redundant, did give him that authority.
I can appreciate it.
See, the problem, I guess, okay, go
I'm
ahead.
going to go to, I'm sorry. Can I go to Mr. Brown, then I'm going to go to Mr. Kiley, who's been quiet.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe you could interpret this for me, because this is coming right out of the charter. This is
Jim, please speak into the mic.
This is a sentence right out of the charter. It says, "All contracts to which the town shall be a party shall be subject to approval of the Board of Selectmen." So all contracts, and again, I'm not a lawyer, to me means all contracts.
Yep.
And just one last,
Sure.
one more sentence. It says, "Contract shall mean all contractual relations of the town, including, without limitation, purchase contracts, lease contracts, and service contracts." So how else does one interpret that?
You know, again, that goes back to my, and I think this was Mr. Williams' point before, but that goes back to my point about you have to read the charter as a whole. You know, you look at, if you only looked at the provision that said he's the chief executive officer of the town, you could say, well, he can do whatever he wants. Well, we know that's not the case. So you try to read the thing as a whole, the charter as a whole, and because it specifically reserved in him, in my view, certain powers relative to the CFO, terms, conditions, et cetera, hiring and so forth, that was reserved in him, so that was a specific exception to the broader rule about the contracts. And the way we viewed it, the way I viewed it, was that you have this document that really does 2 things, one of which is it memorializes terms and conditions of employment, albeit in this case separation, but some of the other pieces, which is clearly in the first selectman's jurisdiction, and then second of all, merely codified existing terms and conditions of employment that he and all other department heads were entitled to. So it wasn't like we believed we were agreeing for the first time to those things. It was my opinion that those were binding on the town, rights that Mr. Hiller had already, and we probably could have ignored them, but, you know, the wisdom was, just to make it clear that he wasn't losing those rights, we codified those in the agreement.
Well, just one follow-up question, then.
Please.
Where would it, where in the charter does it counter all contracts, then? If I can't read one sentence, where can I read it says something different? Is it in there somewhere?
You know, it's a combination, you know, and I can give you the sections of the charter and the statute you have to read, but if you start with the general statutes, first selectman is the chief executive officer, case law interpreting that, saying that includes the ability to set terms and conditions of employment for employees. The charter says the exact same thing under the duties and responsibilities of the first selectman. Then you have certain positions which are reserved solely in the Board of Selectmen. So when you read that, again, holistically, that says to me that when it comes to the CFO and the terms and conditions, that's reserved in him. So, you know, I could point to you the provisions in each of those if I had time, but it's really reading all those together and trying to make sense of the document as a whole. Otherwise, it's sort of like ignoring the other parts of it, and you can't do that either.
Right, I guess that's what I'm asking, but if it's a long litany of things, is what are the other parts? Just mainly because I just simply want to understand. Because it seems pretty clear, but from listening to you, it's not really that clear.
Frankly, it's not that clear in the sense that if you just look at that one provision, I understand the point, and I looked at it too and scratched my head, you know, sort of before and after the fact. But again, I came back to, you know, trying to look at the document as a whole, and you start with the very broad powers and authority, and then you have a specific exception to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kylie, I'll go to you, but I have one quick
Please
one
follow up.
beforehand. Just, document as a whole, right? One thing that really bothers me is why was the clerk of the Board of Finance included in this?
You know, I would,
I don't think that's a legal point. I think that, as I said,
It's in the charter. He said, look at the charter as a whole.
in
the
all
charter.
honesty, I didn't even focus on that at all. I was focused on the chief financial officer.
It's
Right, so
actually,
it's an error.
it's actually a breach of the charter.
Right.
It's a breach of the charter, because you guys can't touch our clerk.
Okay.
You have no authority. That is, Mr. Dugas, will you agree on the town's behalf as their attorney that that Mr. Tetro has no ability to touch our clerk?
I haven't.
Anything to our clerk?
Yeah, I honestly, I was not focused in on that issue. I think it's a valid point.
So is the
Not
agreement
that the
invalid because you have?
No, no.
So is that
No,
provision
no,
valid?
No, listen, here's what I would say to that. If Mr. Tetro had unilaterally terminated him as clerk of the Board of Finance, I think you'd have a valid point, but that's not what happened. There was a mutual agreement entered into where Mr. Hiller agreed voluntarily to step down from that position.
But let me ask you a question, that we weren't party to that agreement.
No.
So how can, and I'm not a lawyer, but how can they mutually agree on a position that has nothing to do with Mr. Tetra? Or the first selectman, I don't mean to personalize it. I didn't ask whether it breached it. I asked, how can he do it? How can you reach an agreement? How can you barter away his services for us without consulting us?
Mr. Hiller or any person serving as clerk can voluntarily resign at any point in time. And again, it was part and parcel of the agreement.
We already said it wasn't voluntary. We had to negotiate him out to voluntarily leave. That was my original point. Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first clarify a couple comments and kind of write about what we're talking about. My first comment is going back to Mr. Tetro's opening remarks, and two things I wrote down were that Mr. Hiller is no longer in this position, not of his choosing, And I'd like to reiterate the comment that Mr. Walsh made toward the increasing number of concerns that were contained in his remarks. The not of his choosing remark obviously lets us know finally where we are, certainly in conflict of the first press release that went out to the public on this particular matter. The second press release was markedly different in tone and in content and in opinion. So quite frankly, I'm looking forward to the third press release that might possibly explain what really happened in its entirety, and so that everyone can finally know what really happened. Along with that, when you start talking about increasing number of concerns, I get concerned that maybe we're making disparaging remarks toward our former CFO. And I'm not sure whether that's appropriate, I'm not sure whether that's allowed, and I'm not sure whether the agreements that have been signed would allow for those types of comments to be made. So I think we need to be careful. Mr. Dugas, you made a couple comments that were of interest to me. The first is you have stated a couple times that you have had a very limited focus on this project when you were explaining why you did not consider whether this agreement or contract should be considered by the Board of Selectmen. And you've noted that a couple times along the way in answering your questions, that your focus was pretty narrow. That's fine. That tells me that you had a very narrow, potentially, toward the end of the process, involvement in this matter. So it begs the question to me that if you didn't decide that this was an agreement that should go before the Board of Selectmen, then who did?
I'm not so sure. It's quite accurate to say, I didn't get involved to the very end of the process.
Fair enough. I can retract that part, but the rest of it, please, stands.
Yeah. It's not like there was a conscious decision, as I recall it, certainly not on my part, to skirt the Board of Selectmen. My focus was first and foremost in negotiating and documenting a mutual agreement. That was the primary focus. When the question came to me, do I have the authority as first selectman, my first reaction, having represented other municipalities in similar situations, was that you absolutely do. I looked at the charter, again, read it as a whole and concluded that, in fact, he did. It wasn't, there was no conscious effort on my part, or to my knowledge, Mr. Tetros, although I won't speak for him, of trying to subvert any particular process. The question was, do I have the authority to do this? And I believed he did. Hope that answers.
You've answered that question the same way a number of different ways, and I respectfully disagree with you. My next comment is going back to Mr. Dugas. You had mentioned a couple times about using the department head memo that's floating around Town Hall. Might I add, a memo that was cobbled together by the former administration, that to my knowledge was never shared or voted on by any town body, and I'm not sure whether it needed to or what the exact process for that would be. But can somebody please validate to me the contents of that memo, how it stands up against the charter, how it stands up against employment law, and why would we want to use that as both a benchmark and/or rationale or reasoning for handling this situation the way it's been handled?
Just to be clear, Mr. Kiley, you're referring to the benefit summary?
Yes. I mean, if we're going to rely on such a document to defend some of the actions that have been taken, I would like to get a legal opinion, whether it's from Mr. Lesser or from the administration, on the components of that document and, what they truly mean. And was that document ever properly vetted or voted on by the appropriate town bodies, if need be?
In terms of that question, the only thing, obviously I don't have any firsthand knowledge of any of that. My understanding was that this was a document that was prepared by the first selectman. It was modified by the first selectman, and my understanding, rightly or wrongly, was that it was not vetted through Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen, any other entity.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess I'd concur that I hadn't seen it until it was handed to me when I became first selectman.
All right, so just one last comment on that. Whether that document was vetted or whether that document stands up, what part of that document, since you referred to it, are supportive of this action? I mean, why is it being mentioned? What part of it pertains?
Well, first and most importantly, it is a document that my understanding, in speaking to the personnel director, is that these are in fact the benefits of the department heads. So that was the first thing. It was relevant and germane in the sense that these were things that, based upon the written document signed by the first selectman, and my understanding from the personnel department, I apologize if I'm getting the title not correct, but that was in fact the terms and conditions of employment. So it was relevant in that these were things to which the CFO was entitled to as his terms and conditions of employment. The only point in referencing it relative to the first selectman's authority is that it was explained to me, it was my understanding that this was not, this was entered into by the first selectman, and that it tended to corroborate my own independent conclusion about the first selectman's authority, at least insofar as it related to the CFO.
Thank you.
And I make that point because, as I'm sitting here and thinking about it, and I made the point before, there are some positions which are subject to the Board of Selectmen's authority. CFO is not one, so to the extent that this document covers people who under 1.4, whatever it was, B2, I suppose somebody could make the argument that it should have gone through the Board of Selectmen as to the folks over whom the Board of Selectmen, clearly under the charter, have jurisdiction in terms of compensation and the like.
Thank you.
Mr. Walsh, if there's nobody else, I just want to make sure everybody gets equal time here. Mr. Walsh?
I don't know if anybody on this board has ever seen this agreement, this benefit summary for non-union department heads and public officials. I don't know what I was more shocked at seeing is the terms of the settlement agreement or the terms of this, which, I was on the RTM for 12 years, and before I was on the Board of Selectmen, and I never even knew this existed. So when we're going through budget process, I never even knew this document existed and what these benefits are. Having gone through it, I will say that it's a little embarrassing that some of these benefits are much better than what we're trying to get our unions to take right now. And, it's a little shocking to see some of this stuff. We seem to have a history of secret documents lately in this town, and I would say this one ranks right up there with one of them, that this was never supplied to any town body. And I'm asking all of you whether you've ever seen this document, because I haven't.
No, and can we get it copied and distributed if it's?
Well, it was attached to Mr. Hiller's settlement
It's
agreement.
attached to the settlement agreement, so you already have it.
This thing.
Yes, I saw that, right.
Can I see it for a second?
Yeah.
I'm following up on Mr. Walsh's question here, and I'd like a legal opinion on it at this some point, not from you. We're going to, and not.
I won't ask how you mean it.
Yeah, that didn't mean that way. I didn't mean it in that way. But from our town attorney, when I look at this, and to Mr. Walsh's point, this is, as I recall, never say never, right? But I don't ever recall seeing this document. I think Mr. Tetro said when he was on this board.
I didn't see it till I got to this office.
Yeah. The interesting part about this is this the same is this the same document that governs what the first selectman gets?
As first selectman is included as a department head, correct.
Well, what's interesting is the one thing this board does do is vote on the compensation for first selectman. So how can the first selectman be covered by this when it's a document that the Board of Finance has never seen? And, as you said, it's better benefits than we...
Then we're trying to get our union employees to go go down to. And-
Yeah,
And that's
actually-
particularly concerning, especially, Mr. Tetro, since, it says that it will be reviewed annually by the first selectman. You've been in office for a full year now. So obviously, you looked at this and you thought that this benefit package should stay in place for another year.
Let's clarify a few things there.
Okay.
One is that I currently have that clearly states on it that will be reviewed by the Human Resources Director
And the first
and
selectman.
the First Selectman. I've currently tasked the Human Resources Director with taking a look at that. And typically, as it was explained to me, and it makes sense logically, that the department head benefits should kind of track with the mid-manager benefits. Since we're in the process of negotiating the mid-manager contract, we are looking at modifying that based on what the agreements are that come with that contract settlement.
And that might be a great idea, except it would have been very easy to write a one-pager or one paragraph on there saying it should track it, but it doesn't. The other disconcerting part about it is this last version, and I would make a request through the chairman that we have every iteration that's ever existed on this document to see how benefits have changed for department heads and when they changed. Because what's most disconcerting to me is the date that this is signed, March 2011, by our then first selectman, Kenneth Flato, because he had pretty much accepted a job with the state in March of 2011. So what would be interesting to see is what benefits increased that would apply to himself, correct?
I believe we have a copy of the prior version. I don't have it with me right here, but we certainly can get that for you.
And my
and it-
recollection, excuse me, is there was one minor, I remember looking at both, and there was one very minor change. I didn't even think it made any sense, to be honest with you. So, you'll see for yourself, but I don't think there was any real substantive changes.
All right, I guess I'm making a request to the chairman for every version of this that this town has historically to see how these benefits have changed. It just seems strange that a first selectman's leaving and, taking another job or accepting one in March of 2011, and then all of a sudden we're having a change in that.
You'll note that it said revises 2005 policy, so I'm pretty sure that was the date of the...
The last
other
one?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go to Mr. Polito. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to switch gears for a moment, because I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on the role of the Board of Selectmen. I think we're kind of at impasse with that. As far as Mr. Hiller's, can I see that, please? Sure. Thank you. As far as Mr. Hiller's position for the next year, the Manager of Financial Services, that's a new position, is it not? It's not Chief Fiscal Officer, so.
It's a new title with different job responsibilities, but it's not a new head count or something along those lines.
Is there a job description that exists for this position yet?
Not at the moment.
Okay. What duties do you envision for this particular job description?
As I described, that would be something that would be jointly decided with Mr. Hiller, Mr. Mayor, and myself.
All right. Do you envision it being something different from what his duties were as Chief Fiscal Officer, assuming that it's an advisory
To a certain degree,
position?
very definitely.
Very different.
Very definitely, that it would be different because it won't include all of those things. But again, we will sit down and work out those job responsibilities to make sure everybody's clear on that.
The reason I ask is that there is a provision of the town charter. It's Section 6.1, subsection G, reorganization of departments, and I want to get Mr. Dugas's, or I'm sorry, Attorney Dugas's opinion about this. It says, notwithstanding any provisions of this charter, the Board of Selectmen may propose to the RTM a resolution which may alter the method of appointment to or organization of any town office, department, board, commissioner, agency of the town, including combining or separating the duties of such individuals or bodies. The resolution will affect the change when enacted by the RTM in the form of an ordinance. The reason I ask about this is it would seem that what's essentially going on here in this, the creation of this position, is a reorganization of a town office. And if you read this provision of the charter, it would seem to indicate that that must come by a recommendation of the Board of Selectmen and then enactment and an ordinance by the RTM. What's your position on that, Attorney Dugas?
Well, it says that and I'm just I mean, I've certainly read it before. because I read the whole charter, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, but it says that the Board of Selectmen may propose to the RTM. To me, that says, state the obvious, that it's something they may do, but it doesn't say, and only the Board of Selectmen may propose any RTM. So it just, yeah.
Confirm with counsel.
So I don't see that, in any way prohibits what's happened in this particular situation. And, again, if you look at the executive powers of the first selectman, among other things, direct the administration of all departments and officers, so arguably it's covered.
But this is pretty specific, though, and it says, unlike some of the other things we've been talking about, notwithstanding any provisions of this charter.
Right.
So why would the RTM or the drafter of this go to the trouble of separating this out, saying, regardless of what else is in the charter, this is something that we put in the purview of the Board of Selectmen and the RTM? It's very specific, so it goes to intent. Attorney Lesser, do you have something? Please, thank you.
First of all, they use the term may.
Understood, it's not shall.
It's not mandatory, and it just gives them the right. If they want to propose something, they have the right to do it. If you look at 6.2A3, which was just talked about,
right.
It says the first selectman shall. It's his duty to direct the administration of all departments and officers. That means he basically can tell all the departments and officers how to perform their jobs and what their duties are. That's his job. He's the chief executive officer of the town. So I think that with all due respect, I think you're missing the point a little bit. If the Board of Selectmen wants to rearrange the departments, they may do that, but that's not the only method.
Understood they use the word may rather than shall. That's a fair point. But let's say for the sake of argument that the Board of Selectmen decides they do want to. Then what?
Then they go ahead and do it.
Well, they make a proposal to the RTM.
So what you're saying is that, on one hand, the first selectman has absolute authority to create this position, but on the other hand, you're saying, but the Board of Selectmen may, if it decides to, do something else, which would seem to subvert the authority of the first selectman.
Well, no, it says that it may, let me find the provision here.
It's on page C8, I'm not sure which version you got, but it's on page C18 of mine.
And one is actually changing the organizational chart.
Why would there be such a specific thing that says notwithstanding other provisions of the charter and create this other process? What's the intent?
Go ahead.
Can I answer that?
Go ahead.
Please.
Let's say that the Board of Selectmen felt that it was in the best interest of the town to, say, combine the zoning department and the conservation department into one. That's a reorganization of the departments. That's not changing the day-to-day operation and ordering. That's, I believe, what that section is for. If they want to do a reorganization, if they want to combine departments, if they want to change things, that's what that section of the charter is for, not the day-to-day operation of the individual officers.
But it does say also separating, not just combining, separating.
Separate, combine, right. They can do whatever they want.
So
Okay? It just
aren't you
gives
in
them
a
the
sense
right to do it.
separating duties here, though, by creating a different position for Mr. Hiller where, granted, the duties are to be determined, but it would seem that certainly some of the duties that he once had will be carried over to the new position. He'll have some new duties. Wouldn't that, in your mind, create a separation of duties in an existing town office?
This is more of a work assignment issue than it is a reorganization of departments.
Well, let me ask you this. You created a specific title, Manager of Financial Services. Do you envision this position surviving Mr. Hiller, or is this something that we're going to have to budget for in future years, or is it something that is specifically tailor-made for Mr. Hiller, and when he's gone, so is the position?
When he's gone, so is the position.
All right. So in your opinion, this is something that does not contradict or supersede the first selectman's authority? That's
No.
your legal opinion?
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Mr. DeWitt, you had a question?
Again, another non-lawyer. What I don't understand about this position is there's no specific budget line item for this position. So, and I know this position is starting right now, and it'll go into next fiscal year. So if the first selectman decides in the next budget process to add a line item with this amount, we decide to reject it, or the RTM decides to reject it, doesn't this make this document void? You're creating a position here that we're no longer funding as a town body, because it is within our purview to cut it, or the RTM's purview to cut that line item.
What happened simply is, with Mr. Hillard stepping down for the title of Chief Fiscal Officer, there are a number of responsibilities left, and so that position, that body, has a different title, but has a lot of the same work assignments. We've transferred...
But that has an existing line item today. I can open this new budget book we just got tonight and find a line item there, but I can't find one for Manager of Financial Services.
Correct.
And very well, even if it's proposed in the budget, we could eliminate that one line item and still have a line item for Mr. Hiller's existing budget for another person to fill.
This
next year.
approach gets us through this fiscal year. That's all.
Doesn't that extend until 2013?
June 30th, which
The end
is,
of our
we're in
fiscal
fiscal year 13.
There's nothing past the existing budget's fiscal year.
Correct.
Yeah.
So so it'll come from the line item, that's Mr. Hiller's, or the current CFO's. Okay.
Mr. Walsh?
Since this position's not going to be lasting past June 30th of 2013, the whole position seems like a sham, because it's just a way of paying Mr. Hiller. It's just a payout. It's just a payout on a settlement agreement. It's just making him, he only has to come to work 2 days a week. I just don't get it. You're going to have to create a job description, and it's basically do whatever we want you to do. It means if we want you to sit behind the desk, it's sit behind the desk. The whole thing just seems like a sham. Further, is Mr. Mayor or as interim going to be able to do both of his positions as chief of staff? He's got plenty of time in his day in his chief of staff position to now take over the CFO role. Because I think a very legitimate question is going to come up during budget season is, this is great. We'll have them be the same thing next year. Everything's worked out great. And we'll have just pay for half a position, and we'll save all that money.
From the top, what we're talking about is the title of Chief Fiscal Officer moving from one person to another. The workload has 2 people today, it will have 2 people after. The amount of work, as I described, to give Mr. Hiller a certain amount of flexibility and really targeted towards the latter part of the year. On any week, we said a minimum of 2 days. We didn't say a maximum. We're committed to getting the full amount of the work done between 2 bodies today and 2 bodies tomorrow.
Okay, let's go there. So he leaves. There's provisions in here regards if he leaves tomorrow. He leaves tomorrow. Now we just have 1 body, right? And we're not going to hire this other position. No one's going to be hired in the position of this manager of financial services, correct? You're not going to hire anybody in that position, are you?
Correct. Now, going into next year, we'd have a CFO position as we did coming into this year.
But if
in the
Mr.
finance
Hiller gets a
department.
position in another municipality or in the private sector anywhere, are you going to fill a seat for the manager of financial services?
No, we're going to go out and get a person to be permanent CFO as soon as we can fit it in the budget.
Okay. And if he does that, and say he's, works himself, say he's, because I've always found Paul to be a pretty smart guy. So if he goes to some other position and he says, I'll tell you what, pay me $1 until January 1st, and then double my salary for the next 6 months so I can make it up. We kind of get screwed in that because, right, because we're still going to have to pay him his $134,000 from whatever day he resigns during the first 6, up until December 31st, 2012, up until that point, correct?
Potentially. But it would take us a
And
while to...
so you guys knew that when you negotiated. I just want to make sure that you understood that. Both of you. That's a question.
Yep.
Okay.
The it would take more than 2 weeks to find another CFO coming in to do a full search and that type of thing. So you know you're going to be on the hook for some of that at some point.
But if that happens, Paul still is entitled to, and I calculated through September 15th, if that were to happen, through December 31st, we'd owe Paul just shy of $40,000 of salary, even though he was going to work someplace else.
Potentially, if that were to happen.
Okay, and you calculated that number, you knew that as part of your negotiations?
We knew that would possibly an option,
Okay.
but a low probability one, yes.
It was a low probability? Why would, explain to me your reasoning on why that's a low probability, because there seems to be some jobs that I've been reading in the paper that are opening up, especially one up in Shelton.
Yep, we just thought that would take some time at that time, and that was before the job in Shelton opened up.
Okay. But we've exposed the taxpayers to that $40,000 as a negotiated term, that even if he's not working for us, we're still going to pay him that money. Correct? Correct?
If that's the way the agreement reads, yes.
Well, I'm asking our attorney how it reads.
There,
I think between now and the 31st, we're obligated.
frankly, I'm not sure I remember the question, but I
Okay,
do. But
here,
but
let me
clearly-
pose a scenario to you, because and the question is twofold. I'm going to ask you whether you agree with what I say, and then I'm going to ask you, did you think about this while negotiating the document?
Okay.
The first is, if Mr. Hiller walks in tomorrow morning and says, I've accepted another job, whether it be in the private sector or the public sector, and I'm getting paid $1 until December 31st, are we on the hook to pay him the continued salary minus that $1 up until December 31st?
No. If you're asking me, is it possible that there would be, you know, a scam, essentially, where...
Mr. Dugas, I'm not asking you whether there's a scam. I'm asking you if Mr. Hiller calls in tomorrow to Mr. Tetro and says, I've accepted another position, and from September 5th until December 31st, I'm making $1, would we have to pay him his salary of $134,591, pay that salary up until December 31st?
If you're talking about, I mean, obviously, it would only be a small portion of that 134,000.
Well, it'd be three and a half months.
Yes,
Actually, maybe a little bit longer, but approximately 3.5 months.
yes.
Yeah, because I've done a calculation based on the $134,591, and that works out to $39,255.71.
Okay. I don't dispute that.
So we would have to pay him that money.
Yes.
You will also note in the contract, though, he is required to work for the town for that time period.
Is he or is he not? Or can he take another job?
Can I?
With my reading of it, he can take another job anytime he wants to take another
Is
job.
it on
Believe
this?
that's
Yeah, it is
correct.
on this, and I may have read this wrong. I'm reading it from the date hereof until December 31st of 2012. Hiller's salary shall remain at $134,591 on an annual basis. In the event Hiller shall accept full-time employment with another employer, any employer, it doesn't specify town or private, prior to January 1, 2013, which prevents him from continuing to work for the town shall continue to pay him his salary of $134,591 until December 31st of 2012, and thereafter its obligation under this paragraph shall end. So the answer is yes, regardless
Yeah,
of whether he
I
takes a
agree.
job or gets paid $1.
I
That's
don't-
how I read that.
I don't disagree. I'm sorry, I
So
didn't
it's no
understand the
offset
point.
through December, it's just he gets
Correct.
paid the
That's my
amount
understanding.
if he
The
walks away
offset
tomorrow.
piece takes place the first half of next year.
Right.
The potential offset piece.
What was the thought of that? Because most severance agreements are saying now that if you take another job, your severance ends or you get the difference between the two.
Actually, I've seen it go both ways.
Well, I've seen it go both ways, I guess, in corporate settings, like with Goldman Sachs, and I've had a client at IBM and some others. But municipalities are generally not giving these golden parachutes
Well,
I
I
mean,
wouldn't...
what's your experience with municipalities?
I wouldn't characterize it as a golden parachute. What I would say is I have seen agreements that have a complete drop dead if there's employment, and I've seen agreements that provide some minimum payment through a certain period of time. I've seen it both ways.
All right.
And you know, again, we did discuss this as we were working through the agreement, and I believe Mr. Tetro, you know, is fully aware that, you know, he's got to live within the budget, and that he would have to do that, you know, within the existing budget.
All right. If Mr. Hiller, so he can make a settlement, because he can't just, he couldn't just sign an agreement saying that he's giving to settle this thing, he's giving Mr. Hiller $5 million, right? He couldn't do that because it's not in the budget, right?
Correct.
So if it's in the budget, he can do it. So how is it going to be in the budget if Mr. Hiller stays on through the way it's hoped to happen through June 30th, and he stays there and gets the 110 for the last 6 months? And where's the extra money in the severance for the 5 extra months of pay? Because we owe him 3 months' worth of severance, that's 3 months. And we owe him 60 days, which is another 2 months of vacation time. So that's 5 months. So explain to me where that is all in the budget.
Well, I'm not the guy to ask the budget questions for, but I can tell you that, A, when we went through this, we acknowledged that as an existing obligation. My understanding, and subject to correction by others, is that the way that this town, as well as others in my experience, deal with provisions like that is it's built into a contingency, because you're going to have, in any given year, employees retiring, resigning, and so forth, and they're entitled to a payout of those kinds of benefits.
Yeah, unfortunately, with our budget, we have a very, very, very low contingency. It's like $200,000, and unfortunately, the presenter before you, Dr. Title, just said that there's $300,000 that has already been spent.
400.
Almost 400, well, 300 out the door of invoices that are already paid. So we really don't even have a contingency any longer. So I'm questioning where this is in the budget. Is it in the budget on the finance department budget?
Let me take that. I think that what you're pointing out is something that we've identified going back several years, is that when you look at the vacation banks that build up, not only in this position, but in positions across the town, it's basically an unfunded liability. We're not reserving money for those vacation banks. So you saw that jump up when Mr. Fladel left last spring. You saw a bump because of the vacation time that kicked in. You've seen it in other cases as department heads have left.
So the goal is to handle it within the budget?
Most definitely. We'll handle it the way we have traditionally handled it.
We've
Absolutely.
always handled it by it's come from other areas of the budget.
Yes.
So the goal is to, basically, you said, hey, we knew this going in, we decided to do it anyway, and we're going to handle it by transferring it from other areas of the budget.
At the moment, that's where that's how we've traditionally handled it, and those are the tools available to us.
But the time you negotiated this thing, you knew that our contingency was a little over $200,000, right?
And we'd also identified $850,000 worth of adjustments that we could use to make that contingency number up.
Oh, really? So we're over $1 million on our contingency then? Is that where we are right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Not in, and let's rephrase that. Specifically, the RTM cut $850,000. Right. We know we need that money for labor contract settlements. We know we need that for some additional amount of funds in contingency on top of that. We sat down with department heads the latter part of June, made those adjustments. Those are some of the adjustments you've seen come up in terms of DPW projects, park and rec adjustments, library adjustments. We took those across the board. The goal was to make up the $850,000 cut by going to other accounts and basically asking our department heads not to spend beyond a certain level. So we'd have that money available when and if we needed it for the union contract settlements or other contingency issues.
That money's spent because you already calculated what you owe, what you believe is going to be owed pursuant to the contracts that are supposed to be signed within this fiscal year, correct?
Correct. And there is some contingency money within that also. Because we're going back to what the original budget was, if you will. And the original budget had a settlement estimate for contracts as well as a certain amount for contingency.
And we've also been spending a lot of money on the Osborne Hill situation, which you know about too. So it seems to me we still have this gaping hole of money that we have to pay Mr. Hiller and no place for it. There's 5 months of pay.
In the same way that we have additional funds we're going to owe Mr. White.
Why, did he get the same deal Mr. Hiller got?
No, but he did retire, and he did have vacation time coming.
How
and he
much
did have
vacation
deferred
time?
compensation.
Does everybody get
I think
60?
it's a 60-day max.
Does everybody get 60 days, or is it?
If they have, up to 60 days if they have it in the bank.
So we do track it, that's what I want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you read
Thanks.
the benefit sheet, it says a
Fine.
max of 70 days, but you
Yep.
don't get paid out more than 60.
Yep. No, I know that, I just didn't know, I know in Mr. Hiller's agreement, and I said, and I just blew it because I said I was never going to refer to him by name, but I knew in the CFO's agreement that it said he would be paid out 60 days of vacation. I had no idea whether he had 60 days of vacation or whether that was just a contractual term. Was he owed 60 days of vacation?
That's my understanding.
A quick question, and it's more operational. I want to get, if I can, leave the legal for a second. This is the financial operations side of me. So we have the chief of staff, who's going to be functioning as the acting CFO. So he's going to maintain his chief of staff functions. He's going to take on additional functions as the chief financial officer.
Yes.
Our present CFO is going to transition into this manager of finance function, whatever the term is. And he's going to augment the fact that Mr. Mayor is only going to be able to spend part-time acting as the CFO. And that transition is going to take place. And basically, the 2 days a week is a minimum, but he's, at the end of the period of time, basically the way it was so that he'd have more time to find a job, right? Okay. Is Mr. Mayor being paid any more money for acting as the CFO?
No, he's not.
Okay. And there's no expectation that he will be during this 12-month period?
No.
Okay. I believe I'm right only because I work very closely with our current CFO, who's also our clerk of the board for a little while longer. I believe he's already only working 2 days a week. So how are we getting everything done? Because I have concerns about the financial operations of the town, and are we able to get everything done presently with that reduced staffing level?
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Hiller and I will sit down at the end of this week. Mr. Mayor, as you know, is back from vacation tomorrow, and we will work through that and make sure that all the work is getting done.
So it's not defined right now, it's not laid out right now, what that work schedule is going to be and what the availability is going to be.
Correct.
So, and when does the agreement, I mean, I know he's already only working 2 days a week, but the drop dead date for the agreement to go into effect is what, September 15th?
September 15th.
Okay.
So since the agreement's been in place, we've had a CFO who's been working 2 days a week, to your knowledge?
I didn't realize.
So
it-
6
I-
weeks up until September, well, today, we get 10 days left by tomorrow.
Yep, actually, I was on vacation for 2 of the weeks, so no, I didn't realize that.
Mr. Brockville?
Thanks. Well, one thing I'm learning from this meeting is why lawyers' bills can can rake up so fast to the people here. It seems to me that I'm going to try and redirect this just a bit, if I could,
Please.
because I think that I happen to be a believer, and I think Mr. DeWitt can agree, based on our time in the nonprofit group we have, that I'm a believer that the first selectman or the chief CEO should have discretion in terms of running the town. And to tell you the truth, I think there are obviously concerns about this agreement. We can disagree with the way it was put into effect, we can have differences of opinion from a legal matter, but I do believe that at the end of the day, that the first selectman has the right to, within reason, have the people in place that he wants. So I'm going to try and redirect for a second from whether it should have happened to what's in the agreement, if I could.
Sure.
Because I have a couple of financial concerns, nuts and bolts. One is that, two really, when I read the first page here, I see, I lost it, I should have underlined it, I apologize. It said, oh, here it is. Halfway down the first page, number 1, Hiller hereby irrevocably resigns from his employment, keyword being resigns. And then I go to page 2, number 3.
You're sounding suspiciously like a lawyer, but...
I know I am. I know I am. My mother thought I should have been a lawyer. Would have made her much more proud. But in number 3, in the second paragraph, it says that he's receiving 13 weeks of severance pay. And I really am a little confused about that, because I thought severance pay is when someone is, I don't want to use a bad word, fired or removed, not when they resign. So if one of you two want to address that, that's my first of 2 questions.
Sure. First of all, I don't know if it matters, but the resignation is effective June 30th, 2013. Just to complete the sentence, you know, again, because of disparagement and other things, respect for Mr. Hiller and so forth, we don't want to get into a lot of the details of concerns and so forth, but suffice it to say that, given the circumstances, the document says resigns, but under the circumstances, it was my judgment that he would have still been entitled to the severance under that agreement. And I'd rather not get into a whole lot more than that, except to say that, given the circumstances under which this situation was coming together, that I felt he would still be entitled to that, and I so advised the first selectman.
Okay, yeah, I'm being sensitive to what you're trying to say here, and I don't want to, you know, I have nothing but the highest regard for Mr. Hiller as well, so I'm not trying to get into any of the background at all. But I guess, like I said, I'm just a little uncomfortable because this is a fairly generous package. There's a lot going on in this package, and then we're adding something called severance to something where someone resigned. It doesn't...
That really comes out of the benefit sheet? All right,
which I didn't print.
Okay, and if you look at that, it does attempt to define it there.
And I apologize because I didn't print out the benefit sheet. I didn't read it. But does that benefit sheet say that if someone resigns, they get 13 weeks of severance?
It does not, but, you know, again, under the circumstances, because this was initiated by the first selectman, we felt it wasn't a true 100% resignation in the truest sense, and that therefore, under the circumstances, it triggered that provision.
Okay. I'll move on to the second one because I can see this would be another example of where the legal bill would would ramp up if we were to discuss it all night.
Ken?
Yes.
Can I just,
Sure,
one of our
but-
attorneys wants to comment on the
Sure,
legal
but
issue.
if you can come back to me. 'Cause I've-
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
No, Ms. Barfield, I had this exact same point. I kind of found it, because I did read the benefit thing that was attached, and the first thing says, in the event of a permanent involuntary termination from the payroll. And then when I read the agreement, it talks about one of the first things it says in the first numbered paragraph is what you had quoted, that he hereby irrevocably resigns from his employment effective June 30th, 2013. So those two ideas seem to be polar opposites. I guess I understand Mr. Dugas's point. I guess it was more of an ego thing, because you don't want to say you're terminating him or something like that. But when somebody resigns, they normally don't get severance. But yet the agreement reads that way. And it goes against the benefit summary for non-union department heads and public officials. So it's specifically something that's changing that, and is another reason I think it should have gone to the Board of Selectmen as just a check and balance to see whether the Board of Selectmen thought that this is something that taxpayers should have to fund. And I was going to ask that same question. I'm glad you brought it up, but I don't think it reads well. I don't think I don't agree with it, and, but I don't agree with most of this, so that's it.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Mr. Brockfeld. Thank you for being so patient, Mr. Brockfeld.
When am I not? The second question I have for you guys is, this is an area that's of particular importance to me and I think to many of my fellow board members, and this is the pension adjustment. This, to be perfectly honest, when I first got this in the, I guess it was attached to an email when it was, released to the, I guess we got it when it was released to the public, actually.
We did.
Right. I'm not a lawyer, so I really wasn't as attuned to a lot of the things that are being raised here. I have seen separation agreements, obviously, in my career, and so nothing really threw me off except the pension adjustment. Because, not to rediscuss what we discuss here all the time, but the pension issue in the town is, towns all over the country is a, sure, I'll use the word crisis, and I don't think I'm even remotely exaggerating. And while the actual numbers here are probably not huge, although I would, as a digression, Mr. Chairman, I think that we should request a present value calculation of what the adjustment of the pension will actually cost the town, right?
I was going to ask, there was, Mr. Tetra, you had alluded to a financial analysis that was done relative to the agreement. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think that's what you said. Was a present value calculation of the pension liability a component of that financial analysis of the agreement?
And not that I have with me at the moment, but we'll get that.
Okay, tomorrow we can get that?
I don't know if we can get it that quick, but as soon as we have it, we'll get it to you.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Brockman.
Thanks. So, yeah, obviously, the calculation using mortality tables and so forth, you can come up with a present value, expected present value of the cost. But, so I don't think, we have a pension fund that has something like, what, $290 million or something like that. So this is not going to be a gigantic number in that context. Having said that, I think it's a very bad precedent, personally. Mr. Hiller is leaving the town's employ today, not today, I mean within a short period of time. So, he's not working another 4 or 5 years. And yet I mean, I understand what happened here. Obviously, this was another way of compensating him on his way out. But personally, I'd much rather have seen, even though I know it's difficult given the budget and the contingency account and so forth, I'd much rather have said, this is something I'd like to do, and the present value of it would be X, and we're going to write you a check for X. In other words, I think this is a very dangerous precedent to be using the pension fund, which is literally a trust between ourselves and our employees, literally 20, 30, 40 years into the future, and using that to try and pay for a current problem. So I'd like to go on record as saying that, again, we have no purview. I mean, I don't think anybody's arguing that the Board of Finance has authority over this agreement. I haven't heard that. So, I mean, anything I say is just an opinion and being stated for the public record. But I would just say that I'd emphasize again, I think the first selectman has every right to make managerial decisions. But I just think this was a bad choice because I think the pension fund is sacrosanct. I just don't think that's an area we should be going to try and solve current problems, in my opinion.
Ms. McCarthy-Vegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a follow-up question related to the pension and the change in salary which comes at the end, and how, if you can just step us through, for everyone's sake, to understand the authority in that in terms of, is the I don't know the code, and so how it lines up with the code and our practice and/or the agreement that we have for department heads. Oftentimes, we look at salary over the past 12 months. This is salary at the end of the period of time, so how does the authority for that piece of it work?
Simply, the way it's being implemented is the way that the Human Resources Department implements it now. They take the highest salary over the last 12 months, and that's what they assign the pension value to.
And is that part of our code, or is it part of the human resources documents that get used by the pension board?
That's part of how Human Resources determines the salary for pension purposes.
I'm sorry, I missed that last part. Can you say that again?
In other words, is it part of our code that we have related to the pension, or is it kind of rules and regs in human resources that are
Yeah. Well,
an implementation of the code?
yeah, but here's can I follow up, if you don't mind? Question, so the amount, I want to make sure I understand it. There was an amount in the agreement, I think 158 comes to mind, right? The pension benefit is going to be calculated on the 158.
Correct.
Even though, if I have it correctly, the highest amount the CFO has been paid to date is 134. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, so A, does the top off of something like that have to go before the pension boards and be approved by them?
Not the salary, no.
Okay,
Because in essence, we're plugging, that number is pegged by human resources in terms of how they process it for pension, and it goes to the pension board to approve the pension program, because there's 2 or 3 options for the
so
person.
the Human Resources Department calculated that 158
That's the number they would use, correct?
based on what? Since the highest salary he ever made is 134.
We will change that on June 30th, so that will in fact be the highest salary that he's made.
What do you mean?
That it's, if somebody retires on August 1st,
Yeah,
they would retire at what they were earning in July,
yeah.
even though that adjustment might have only been from July 1st on.
So, it is common practice, right before somebody is retiring, to give them a raise so that they get a higher pension benefit than they would have for all the time that they worked?
No.
Okay.
It's not common practice. If someone was retiring and retired right after they got their annual raise, that would be the case. In this case, it was a specific adjustment we made to compensate the fact that Mr. Hiller was leaving early and to get his pension in the same range that would have been if he stayed for another 4 or 5 years, which was his original plan.
So the thought was that if Mr. Hiller stayed for another 4 or 5 years, he'd be making 158.
No, but that would be the range that we had to get it in to get to that ballpark on the pension.
I have no idea what
You've
you
got
just
2
said.
issues. You've got both the dollar percentage increase per year
Okay,
and the increase in pension component per year.
okay,
All right, so you've got 2 different ways that numbers goes up over 4 years.
okay.
Does that make sense? Did I describe that?
Okay, what was Mr. Hiller's increase this year?
Going into this year, there wasn't an increase.
So he got 0. So basically, the top off to 158 from 134, assuming current projections, would be entirely for what was going on the pension benefit side?
No, it was calculated based on assuming a 2% increase per year over 4 years and a 2.275 increase in the pension payout or pension benefit per year.
How often
Years.
do we do this, where the person leaving gets a top off of their pension right before they leave?
To my knowledge, it's the first time I'm aware of it.
It's the first time it's happened.
It's the first time I'm aware of it.
I'm sorry, it's the first time you're aware of it, that's exactly what you said. Okay, but it wasn't run by the pension board?
No.
Mr. Flynn, if
Mr.
I
Kiley.
may, I think I can answer Selectman Kristen McCarthy-Vahey's earlier question. From the Town Code, Chapter 37, under the retirement system, under Section 37.13, there is a definition of annual base salary, consistent with what we've been told, but I will read it. The highest regular annual base salary, which is what they're using, the highest regular salary or wage paid to the member in the town's fiscal year, not including overtime pay, bonuses, allowances, grants, or other similar benefits. So it is a town code, and then it refers to the pension retirement code for implementation of such calculation.
One last question before I go. Is the pension board made, when these, I know, Mr. Tetra, you've been in the job 14 months, so obviously you can't opine to things that have happened in the past. But I wonder if the pension board is made aware of when those type of arrangements have been made in the past, because it obviously has an impact to their actuarial studies and everything else.
In this case, we're lining Mr. Hiller up with what he would have been at, but let's take another case. If you go back a few years, and the only thing I can remember that
And I
is
still don't
close.
necessarily agree with,
Okay.
I haven't seen the math that gets me to the 158, so you're saying it, okay, you know, I just don't.
For,
Argument's sake,
Yeah.
right.
if you go back a few years, I believe there were some early retirement programs
Yep.
that were instituted.
Yep.
And I don't remember whether those, I know they didn't come before the Board of Finance,
Right.
that in fact the number of years of pension folks were given was given credit for that, and I don't know if those went before the pension board per se.
I don't know either. But
That's the closest
we know this board-
example I can come.
Yeah, and we know this board at that time expressed our concern about that, in the very same manner that Mr. Bachfeld did this evening. So, oh, Mr. Hiller.
I'll make my hopefully sole comment for the evening. First Selectman is correct. Well, there's three instances that I can refer the board to. Two, I believe in 2004 and in 2009,
Yep.
when all eligible employees, when I say eligible, that they had reached retirement age and were vested in the pension, were offered the option of 3 additional years of service, which brought them up to whatever level it was at that time. Additionally, on the Police and Fire Board, and I'm not certain of the date, but it's within the last 3 years, there were 3 captains who retired. Prior to that, a chief who had retired. And they were given, within the police department, they were in the Police and Fire Fund, but they were given additional earnings for the calculation of their pension.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Mr. Kiley, did you have your hand up?
No, I was just answering
Okay.
the
Did you-
previous question and pointing it to Paul.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
sorry.
you. Thank you, Mr. Tetro, for that. Let's see if anybody else has.
Mr. Chair, Attorney Dugas just stepped away for a couple of minutes. He'll be right back.
Thank you, Mr. Tetro.
Actually, I do have one.
See, now that Kevin saw that he's gone, he's going to hit you, so go right ahead, Kevin. Yes, Mr.
please.
DeWitt, and then we'll go to Mr. Kiley. We'll
So
go back over.
the firemen, the captains you referred to, do we know if the pension board was made aware of those adjustments?
Pension Board was made aware of the adjustments at the time that the pensions were approved. As to.
So they were made aware of those, but not made aware of the agreement with the CFO?
This one hasn't come before the pension board
That
yet.
hasn't, yeah.
In essence, I believe what Mr. Hiller's saying is they were made, the pension board was made aware of those when it came before them to vote on them, but not before as in an approval process.
Correct. They were negotiated by the first selectman at the time, as was
And after the fact.
the other, which was across the board with both plans, with all eligible employees, the increase in 3 years of service, which was offered to eligible employees.
Thank you. Mr. DeWitt, anything else? No. Mr. Kiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back to an earlier comment about the financial analysis that was done on this deal. I heard that there was a financial analysis done on this agreement.
Yes, for the most part, we looked at this as implementing the benefits in place, but we can go back and pull that together.
Okay, so let me ask you a
We
different
didn't
way.
see this as changing any financial obligations the town had.
Okay. So there was a financial analysis done that predated the agreement?
No, not in that sense.
Okay. And the financial analysis that has been done during this period of time does not include an analysis of the pension obligations looking out?
I don't have that in my hands at the moment, correct?
Okay. So can I follow up on Mr. Brockfeld's request? I think it was for the financial analysis on the transaction, but I'd like to discuss what that financial analysis should contain. Obviously, there's nuts and bolts that even the non-lawyers in the room can read from the agreement and do the calculations. But there is also an analysis that needs to, or there's a component that I think needs to include, with some reasonable assumptions, what the pension component is going to cost, what versus what it would have cost had the change not been made to it. And the other component that I don't know how to get the best handle on, I just throw it out there, is how do we potentially calculate what I would call, I guess, the opportunity costs for, you know, having a full-time CFO position reduced to a 2-day-per-week position named differently. And while it may be difficult to calculate what will and what won't get done on a daily basis, is there a way that we can incorporate some of that opportunity-type thinking into this analysis so that we can really see the big picture, including the A's, B's, and C's, the pension stuff, and what it will mean to the town, you know, in the next year or so, based on the organization comments that Mr. Flynn made?
We'll do our best to pull that together.
Thank you.
Mr. Stone, and then I'll go to Mr. Walsh.
I just want to make a few comments. We can discuss this for several more hours, I suppose. But the end result to me is, when I look back on all this, is probably the whole problem is with the charter, with the town of Fairfield. And Paul has served this town for many years, and done a very good job. Mr. Tetreault came into power as first selectman, and as I see it, wanted to make a change. Very simple, but because the way the charter's written, it's very hard to do. So he got legal counsel. They worked out an agreement with Mr. Hiller, and the end result is what we're seeing today. But I think, you know, these jobs, whether it's the CFO or the Department of Public Works or whatever, shouldn't be jobs for life. They should have a contract that states the beginning and an end term, because it's not fair that someone is, I don't want to use the word saddle, but they can't put their own people in place that they're comfortable with. And that's no disrespect to Paul. Paul has done a wonderful job. I've loved working with him. But sometimes, you know, you want to have different eyes look at a position, and it's no reflection on Paul. So that's all I want to say. But I think in the end, you know, Mr. Tetreault, as first selectman, showed some leadership. He wanted to make a change. And I personally think, you know, we should start looking at the charter so this doesn't happen again.
Mr. Walsh.
Well, in reference to that, I understand that, Mr. Stone, but I take a little different tact on it a little bit, because, you know, I don't believe that we've had a history in this town where the CFO position has not really been a political position, that it's been a position that people have stayed at through administrations. I mean, Mr. Leahy was here during the Sullivan, Durrell, and Flato administration. We had Mr. Hiller, who's been here through Flato and Metsopoulos and Tetreault administrations, and now there's a change all of a sudden because some mysterious things. His words were increasing number of concerns. I guess I have concerns when we, at least I've never seen on the RTM Board of Selectmen, and I've not heard anybody concerns through in public about Mr. Hiller's ability to be chief fiscal officer. The guy just came off of, I mean, he just came off of us having a negative outlook, restoring it. Sure, it was based on some of the changes in the budgets based on that this body put in and the Board of Selectmen and the RTM did. But I think the taxpayers got to know what the cost of this change is, to the penny, because that comes with a cost, okay? And that's going to be a cost, at least on the pension side, where we're going to be paying for, you know, hopefully a very, very long life of Paul. But I mean, these are costs that are going to add up, and I think that, you know, one of the things we need to discuss, and I guess the chairman, and maybe we should just all say what we want in this report so that we're very clear and that the first selectman gives us what we want, is what do we want in this analysis to decide what the cost of this agreement has cost the taxpayers of Fairfield.
Right.
Because I would like things, and if you don't mind, I'll start off.
Please.
I would like to know what the actuarial costs are, not just on Mr. Hiller's lifespan, but potentially if he chooses that his wife would get his pension afterwards, that's going to be a different analysis. Those are two different analyses, and I'd like to see both of those. I would like to see the cost of every line of this agreement, every single one, including an analysis of what happens if Mr. Hiller leaves tomorrow versus leaves on June 30th. Because those are calculable costs, and we should know what they are.
Does anybody else have anything to add? I think Mr. Kiley added the opportunity cost component, which, said another way, Mr. Kiley, it's the cost of paying the same rate for 2 days' worth of work, for 5 days' worth of work, for the first 6 months of the agreement or so.
Right.
And paying a reduced rate for 2 days' worth of work, for 5 days' worth of work, for the cost of the agreement. Now, Mr. Tetro, you can say that there was a minimum in there, so you might be able to jump it a little bit, but in essence, you're paying more for less for that period of time. Is that what I'm getting from you?
That's better said than I did, so thank you.
Okay. I had a few minutes to think about it. Go ahead, Mr. Bolito.
Just to reiterate what I requested earlier, formal written legal opinion about the reason why this does not go before the Board of Selectmen for a vote. And I also wanted to get a written legal opinion about why the creation of the manager of financial services position does not fall under that provision of the charter regarding reorganization of departments. So we could just get case law, charter, state statute. I'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Mr. Flynn?
Please.
Before we leave the pension component of the conversation, I wanted to follow up on one of Ken's comments. I guess this would be a comment for Mr. Dugas. And I know there's examples where pensions have been adjusted because of early retirement packages and a couple other scenarios that are probably more common practice than, we had thought about in the past. But this is a pretty unique case. So what are the dangers, what are the risks of us making this one-time pension adjustment for this contract, this agreement becoming a precedent, something that somebody else will look to or lean on for something that they want down the road? Because if we've never done this before, what are the dangers of doing it the first time?
This is not precedent-setting in the way that you think of in the collective bargaining context, because it would have to be precedent within a particular bargaining unit. So I don't see that it sets any precedent from a legal standpoint relative to your collective bargaining groups. Legally, there's no precedent. I understand the concern about, they did it for so-and-so, and that's probably more of a practical or political precedent, but legally, it does nothing.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Mrs. McCarthy-Vahey.
Thank you. And just, again, on the theme of the pension, just looking at the code and back to the section of the code that Selectman Kiley read, the highest regular salary or wage paid to the member in the town's fiscal year, not including overtime pay, bonuses, allowances, grants, or other similar benefits. Later in the code, in 3713, it talks about the fact that the Employees Retirement Board is authorized and directed to adopt rules and regulations. I think it would be helpful for the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance to understand what those rules and regulations are that help clarify in any way that first section of the code that was read by Selectman Kiley, just to make clear for all of us.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? I'll go to Mr. Walsh, and then I'll go to Mr. DeWitt.
Okay, these are more comments, no questions, but clearly, I respectfully, Attorney Dugas, disagree with your interpretation of both our charter and state law in regards to this agreement. I think your advice to the first selectman, and the first selectman taking the advice has usurped the authority of the Board of Selectmen and took them out of the equation for no necessary role whatsoever. And I think it was done on a purposeful, for purposeful reasons. Maybe it was done to expedite the situation, but there's been many situations where these employment issues have gone down to the Board of Selectmen, and I agree that any type of agreement, whether it's a formal lawsuit or whether it's just a claim or a disagreement that ends in a general release, is required to go to the Board of Selectmen in the Board of Selectmen's duties of settling cases. Otherwise, the first selectman might as well just start settling all these lawsuits on his own. I take great, I don't even know what the word I want to choose, but it really rubs me the wrong way. The fact that you usurped the Board of Finance's decision process in regards to our clerk. You negotiated with chips you didn't have. And the first selectman did the same thing by signing that. You basically fired our clerk. Are we allowed to have our clerk come back on now, or is that what you're saying? Can we keep Mr. Hiller on? I guess is a legal question I will ask to you.
You know, if I recall the charter correctly, you have the authority to hire a clerk. So even though we negotiated that voluntarily as part of an agreement, I don't, you know, there's no provision in the document saying he can never come back and work for the town in any capacity. So I don't.
Doesn't it say irrevocably resigned from CFO and Board
That's what it
of
says.
Finance?
It does.
It says irrevocably.
It does, yes.
I said it a different way.
I think my point is simply that there's nothing in there prohibiting you from hiring him in the future back to that position, would be my initial gut reaction.
What about hiring him back right now?
We're not prepared to do that right now, I don't think, based on a discussion I had.
I just want to know the legal answer to that in case we decided to do it.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at it, honestly, off the top of my head.
All right, if you can, to add to your legal positions, if you can please prepare us a legal opinion on whether we'd be able to hire him immediately, or if not, what time we'd be able to hire him.
Okay.
And just to finish up, I think we're setting a very dangerous precedent, and I agree, it's not a legal precedent, so I do agree with you, Mr. Dugas, on that, but the problem is that this has been all over the press, and every town employee now knows what the town of Fairfield will offer in regards to a settlement with the town if they feel like they've been terminated or has a problem. And now it's fully out there, and we have done that without any cost figures whatsoever. It was like cost didn't matter. In advance, we did not calculate what the costs were going to be to the town, to the taxpayers of the town of Fairfield, and I don't think that's appropriate. Thank you.
I believe Mr. DeWitt had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things I learned tonight, is that there's very different legal opinions. We seem to have one, and you seem to have another. I guess my question is, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, short of a charter revision that changes shalls to will, and, you know, because I have no idea if the first selectman's talking to another department head right now that he's appointed and making the same kind of agreement. So how do we 100% know that this will never happen again, and that every one of these things going forward will go to the Board of Selectmen?
I honestly don't know how to answer that. I suppose that the short answer is there is no way at this point to give you 100% assurance.
I mean, structurally, we followed the legal guidelines that are laid out, so that will vary by department head
So we
and
can't.
position.
So this could
The way-
happen again next year,
The way-
a
the
week
way
from
that-
now.
the way
There's
that-
no way, unless we revise our
The way
charter.
the charter is currently laid out, correct.
unless we get a different lawyer giving you an opinion.
Well, what I would say...
In most cases,
I-
generally in
I'm not
most
trying to be
cases, even the ones Mr. Walsh tries, there are two attorneys.
I'm not trying to be flippant, but I mean, it seems
Yeah, but
it's
there,
very
there's
much
a judge.
based on the lawyer's opinion, right? And the second thing I learned tonight is that, just going forward for our next clerk, and I'll pass this through the chairman, boy, for our actuarial analysis, starting the day after today, I want to know what our exposure is for, I wrote down, senior staff in town. So what's our exposure if, because Rich White's gone, he's got a bunch of time we're paying him. Paul, gone. If we have another 3 senior staff going, what kind of exposure do we have? Because I've never heard during our actuarial analysis, like, an understanding of how much it would cost us if every senior person that's had 20 years or 10 years or 15 years in the town just decided to quit. It's immense. We should at least know that from a risk perspective, right? So I would ask, going forward, that our actuaries, I don't know if that's easy or hard, but at least as a risk component, help us understand what that is. Thank you.
Mr. Kiley?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Something is bothering me, and it's a very difficult topic, and it's a very difficult question to ask, and it revolves around ethics, so I have to ask it. But before I ask the question, I just want to make sure that the question's not taken the wrong way by either party or any person in this room, because it's not meant to be disparaging to anyone at any level. But when I look at this contract, when I look at this situation, on paper, I have to say to myself, okay, we have an agreement that's made between 2 parties. They're both town officials. The agreement did not go beyond the first selectman's office, so it wasn't viewed by the Board of Selectmen or anyone else. Those same 2 parties are both members of the pension board. The pension component of this agreement is significant. It makes a difference financially to the town and to the parties of the agreement. So I have to ask, with those facts being as I believe they are, do we have any concerns for conflict of interest or anything along those lines?
I'll take a shot, and
I know it's a difficult topic, but
Yeah.
I have to get it off my chest.
Yeah. In looking at this, what we try to do is find a balance between making a change, having a smooth transition, and respecting Mr. Hiller's need to explore other options. As I laid out in my opening remarks, we looked at the salary component, we looked at the benefit sheet, and our goal was to execute the department head's benefit sheet the way it's laid out. So from that standpoint, there aren't any benefits in there that weren't part of the standard department head benefit sheet. So there weren't any changes along those lines, so there's nothing that we changed to accommodate that.
The salary top-off is not a change to that?
The salary top-off is a change, but it also goes into the standard pension program, and we did that specifically to put Mr. Hiller in a same position he would have been long-term if he stayed here. Stayed as long as he planned, sorry.
Yeah, again, I'm just hearing this for the first time, but my initial reaction is, I don't see it in the sense that it's not like Mr. Tetro voted on something that inured to his financial interest, and at the same time, Mr. Hiller was not doing anything in his role as a pension board member that affected this. So my...
I'm not suggesting that. It doesn't.
No, I know, you're raising the question, and I frankly don't see it.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Mr. Hiller?
Could I just respond to Mr. Kiley's comments? I serve under the charter as a member of the Police and Fire Pension Board. I also serve, which obviously votes on retirements relating solely to the police and fire. I am a member of the town employees pension plan. I am not a voting member. I am an ex officio member of that board, not a voting member of that board. I am a voting member of the Joint Investment Board, which all members are, but they do not vote on specific retirement requests.
Thank you. All right,
Mr. Chairman, just one last thing that came to mind. When we're doing that analysis, can we also get add to that cost analysis what the total legal fees were from both the town attorney and from Attorney Dugas and any other attorney that worked on this
please.
matter, up to date?
Thank you. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
Just to follow up, in terms of the financial analysis, I hope that that information will also get communicated to the Joint Pension Board as well, specifically the Employees Board.
Thank you. You know, in listening to the discussion tonight, I just want to speak for myself, who's had the opportunity to work with both Mike and Paul for 7 years now. It's kind of a sad situation. And my father's words are kind of ringing in my ears, where he would say, and I think it sums up this really well tonight, because something is legal does not make it right. And any way you cut this process was, for lack of a better word, bungled. And it resulted in unintended consequences. Yeah, it resulted in unintended consequences. And I've got 5 things related to that. The first is, and I think we saw it on display tonight as we were going back and forth about the charter, the whole separation of powers, right? And Mr. Dugas, Attorney Dugas, however you'd like to be preferred, I appreciate your time and your attention and your expertise on this, and I thank you for that. But this town has been through a heck of a lot, from the train station deals, to side letters, to union agreements, to other agreements that were signed, to what we found out in the last 36 days or so was a department head summary of benefits that hadn't gone before the town bodies. These are all legally, and not legally, they all have an impact on our town government, whether it be financial, whether it be a degradation of the communications, whether it be a deterioration of the trust between the town bodies. And I go back to something that Mr. Brockfeld said very early on, where he basically said, hey, set aside the legal issue. Why didn't you just go to the Board of Selectmen? I mean, that's historically how we do things in this town. And to say it was legally right doesn't mean it was right. And it doesn't help our government moving forward. As chairman of the Board of Finance, I have 2 responsibilities. Well, we all have responsibilities here, not just me, but it's the financial cost to the taxpayers, which is why I think it is paramount that we understand that better. We don't know what it is right now, but I think there was a lot of good commentary around that now, and that's our fiduciary responsibility, that's our charge. My charge as your chairman of the Board of Finance is a smooth operation of this board, which includes working with, on a day-to-day basis, the clerk of the board. And the fact that that was breached bothers me tremendously. We have a go-forward plan right now. Number one, we're going to immediately form a subcommittee of this board that's going to conduct a search for a new clerk of the Board of Finance. And Mr. Hiller, should you so choose, please apply for that position, assuming it is legally possible. That subcommittee will look, with some help and guidance from Mr. Hiller, on putting together a job description. We will work with the administration to do some advertising for that position, and we will conduct the process and come back with a recommendation on both compensation as well as an appointee for that position. It may take a matter of months to do that. And in the interim, I had reached out to Mr. Hiller and asked if he could serve as our interim clerk And he indicated that for, and I hope I'm not breaching any confidence, for legal reasons, he wouldn't do that at this point in time. So that leaves us without an interim clerk of the Board of Finance right now, because Mr. Hiller is effectively done September 15th. I did, on our behest, reach out to Caitlin Bossi, who works closely with Mr. Hiller, and this is after consultation with Mr. Hiller, and asked if she would serve us in an interim capacity as the clerk of our board while we conduct the search. And Caitlin will do that. And maybe after we finish up this item, we can go back into a little particulars. I hope the board will be supportive of that to effect a smooth transition for an interim period of time. So that's the operation of the Board of Finance. The third item is really the personal aspect of this. The way this played out, unintentionally, though it may have been, saddened me, because it took a good man, Mr. Hiller, who gave 31 years to the town, both sitting where we're sitting as well as where he's sitting now. And it wasn't the end of that career that he deserved. So we'll rectify that with some type of celebration at the appropriate time. But that being said, I'm sorry that that happened. That wasn't right. The next item, and this is something that you have to think of as management. I learned this very early on. How you terminate someone isn't about the impact on them. It's about the impact on the rest of the employees. So this was managed badly, and I'm worried about the morale of the staff in Town Hall. That's a problem that's going to have to be dealt with. I know it'll be dealt with, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. And if I were them, as bad as they feel for Mr. Hiller, they all put themselves in those shoes and say, that could be me. And they all act accordingly. And that bothers me to no end as well. So that's my soliloquy. I'm off my soapbox. Thank you for listening. Mr. Tetra, thank you for coming tonight. This couldn't have been easy. Mr. Dugas, I thank you as well for your time. With that, if there's no other comments or questions from the board, Mr. Bolito, please.
Just briefly, I know it's getting late. The thing that bothers me about all this is that I still haven't heard a good reason why we're getting a new chief fiscal officer. When you pay someone a lot of money to leave, there ought to be a damn good reason, and I have yet to hear that. Now, we could talk about confidentiality, employment law, and things like that, but this is government, and this was anything but transparent. Whoever you voted for last November, I think there was an expectation on the people of this town that there would be something different, that there would be transparency. And there was nothing transparent about this. Not one member of any elected body, either Republican or Democrat, was consulted about this before it happened. And regardless, as Mr. Flynn alluded to, whether it's legal or not, and I think there's some question about that, but let's play devil's advocate and say it was legal, it's still not the right way to do things. It would have been wise to reach out and say, this is a concern of mine, and can you help me out here? What's your opinion? What do you think about this? That's good government. And while the first selectman is the CEO of the town, essentially, this isn't a corporation. This is a town government that provides services that citizens depend upon. And to not reach out, to not take advantage of the resources that are around you at this table, much less at other tables, I think was a mistake. So I just want to say that it would be nice to have some closure and understand why this had to happen. And going forward, I hope it doesn't happen like this again. It can't. We're better than that. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to the public. Thank you for staying with us. If you'd like to, here's what I'm going to say about this. I don't want anybody to entertain questions. We don't do that at our budget hearings. It's not fair to the presenters, to the people that came here as our invited guests. But feel free to come up and make a comment. Please identify yourself, say where you live, and make whatever comment you would like. All right, I know how to close down a room. All right, gentlemen, thank you. And I think this concludes this item on the agenda with the exception of one item. Yeah, Kristen and Kevin, I mean, you're welcome to stay, but feel free to leave as well. Thanks. Guys, thank you. Yeah, the one item we do need to vote on is the clerk. Vote on appointing an interim clerk. Oh, okay. Okay? So I'll take the lead on making a motion, if that's okay. Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I think what you ought to do is make a motion to add it to the agenda, since it's not on the agenda.
Can I make a, thank you, Mr. Hiller. I'm going to miss that. Can I make a motion that well, actually, Paul, those go-forward plans are on the agenda. So there we go. Okay, so I take that back. So I'd like to make a motion that we appoint Caitlin Bossy to be the interim clerk of the Board of Finance until such time as this board appoints a new clerk of the Board of Finance at a compensation to be $800 per month for that interim period. The expectation to be that she's at all the meetings within that period, takes care of the agenda, takes care of the discussions and the planning and the coordination and the appearances of the various town representatives, as well as their consultants, legal counsel, as well as coordinating with the secretary of our board. So that's my motion. Do I have a second? Effective upon Mr. Hiller's resignation, September 16th resignation. Do I have a second to that motion? We have a second by Mr. Bolito. Do we have any discussion on that motion? Please.
Where do you come up with the $800?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stone. That was actually through discussion with Mr. Hiller, and that amount is fully covered by the budget within our department in fees and professional services, Mr. Hiller, correct? And it is also a bit above what the secretary of our board is paid, as is commensurate with that position.
My other question is, I'm
Please.
you answer. She's willing to do it, I assume.
She is. I did reach out to her and had the conversation with her before doing this. Thank you. No, thank you. Those were both excellent questions. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? All right. Go to the public before we vote on this item. Seeing none, all in favor? Oh, I'm sorry, please.
I just want to say I am very impressed with our system of government. I am very proud of our Board of Finance. We handle things beautifully, ask the right questions, and I was just very impressed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That item carries, and we'll reach out to Ms. Bossy tomorrow. All right. This is a very late night for a non-budget night. And in speaking with Mr. Hiller, actually, we'd like to dispense with item number 7, move it to a date certain, which would be our October regularly scheduled meeting.
I believe it's October 2nd. The only concern I have, Mr. Chairman, on that, I have no problem with that. However, Schedule C, which is the town reappropriations,
Yep.
there are 4 items there which total $59,930.50, which are, I know Mr. Stanky's here this evening. The human services is for the bus. The fire, the ECC is for a system that's in place, et cetera. At ECC, the fire department, frankly, was an invoice which Deputy Chief Reed misplaced in his desk and is due. And if it's at all possible, I think it would be better if we looked at Schedule C, which I don't think are terribly controversial items.
And these are items, these are the items that were originally included in the budget?
Yes, yes, in every case.
Does anybody have a problem with Schedule C?
It's reappropriations of those items
Okay, so can we have can you make a motion on Schedule C that we reappropriate those items?
Motion?
Yes. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Walsh. So this is to reappropriate, correct?
Yes.
The items on Schedule C of the handouts, which total $59,930.50, which were included in the original budget, but have not been encumbered
Previously.
as of
The
yet.
biggest one is the other half of the bus for the senior center, which was,
Right. Right. Okay,
which we'd like to get ordered.
all right. Everyone? Okay, any comments from the public? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, that item carries. Can I make a motion that we table the rest of the items on number 7 until our October 2nd regularly scheduled meeting? And Mr. Hiller, you'll continue, or Ms. Bossi will continue to work on those items and have them finalized for that meeting, because I know there's some additional work, maybe some additions to this. Do I have a second to my motion? Second, Mr. Brockfeld. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions, that's done. Okay, number 8, we're going to do the same thing with the exception of item C, which we've just voted on. We're going to table that to October 4th. Do I have a second to that motion? I'll do Mr. DeWitt this time. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions, that carries. I know of no other communications at this time. We have one act of new business, which is actually a sense of the body motion. Mr. Brown, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Same, excuse me. It's what we reviewed last meeting in July 24th, so even if you just take a look at your minutes and go to number 5, what it is, it's the Building Project Process Review Committee. And what we're talking about in this committee, what we're asking the sense of the body to get a sense of the body, is to consider the timing for the review and approval of non-recurring projects, to take it out of the operating, really, timeframe, the operating budget timeframe, and push it up to December, where we would get presented with the non-recurring projects, and we would vote on those projects in January. So we would not be voting on them at the same time as the operating budget.
All right, can you put that in the form of a motion for a sense of the body?
I make a motion for to get a sense of the body for proposed timing for review and approval of non-recurring projects, for a review in December and a voting in January. Review in December of 2012 and a vote in January of 2013.
Do we have a second to that for a sense of the body motion? Mr. Stone, any questions, comments, concerns on that item?
Just a quick one.
Please.
So our sense of the body, that's fine, but I think perhaps the Budget Subcommittee and your committee should probably get together just for scheduling purposes, since, we've discussed this at length, and I know that your committee has as well, so maybe we should get together and kind of nail it down, as it were. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Seeing none, all in favor of this sense of the body motion? Opposed? Abstentions? That carries. We need, oh, Mary, you post. I'm sorry, Mary, I didn't see you down there, my apologies. Yeah, Chris's big head was in the way. All right, there's only one item of business left, and that would be adjournment.
I'd like to make that motion.
Do I have a second? Mr. Bolito. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? And we're done. Thank you, everybody.